What happens when a crown is placed on the head of a teenager in the middle of a revolution? Vienna burns, the empire crumbles, and into the chaos steps a 17-year-old boy, barely out of military academy, tasked with saving one of Europe's oldest dynasties. This is the road to destruction, the world wars. In our Germany series, we saw how Otto von Bismarck forged an empire from war. But across the border, a very different story was unfolding, one of desperation, decay, and a young emperor's burden. Today we rewind to the mid-19th century, before Bismarck, before Wilhelm II, when Austria was still a sprawling, fragile empire ruled by the aging Habsburgs. But 1848 would bring a tidal wave of revolution that swept across Europe, and Franz Josef, barely a man, would be thrown into the eye of the storm. Franz Josef of Habsburg was born in 1830 into a world obsessed with protocol and terrified of change. His childhood was not a playground, it was a preparation. His father, Archduke Franz Karl, was mild, indecisive, seen even within the family as unfit to rule. But his mother, Archduchess Sophie of Bavaria, was made of sterner stuff. Intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely ambitious, she viewed her son not simply as a child, but as a vessel for dynastic salvation. "You are not a boy, you are Austria." Franz Josef was raised in military uniforms, not pajamas. He learned Latin and Hungarian alongside fencing and statecraft. There were no fairy tales, only the glories of the Habsburgs and the enemies of the empire. Sophie kept him close, molding him into the image of a perfect ruler, as if she could will the empire's survival through her son's discipline. But behind the rigid etiquette, there was a deeper fear. She knew the monarchy was rotting from within. Nationalism, liberalism, revolution, these were not abstract ideas. They were storm clouds already circling the imperial court. And this boy was their last hope. The Habsburg court was not a warm place, and the imperial nursery was no exception. Franz Josef was the eldest of 4 brothers and a sister. There was Ferdinand Max, brilliant, charismatic, and curious, everything Franz Josef was not allowed to be. Charles Louis, shy and sickly. Ludwig Victor, the baby, doted on and indulged, and the lone sister, Maria Anna, mentally disabled and hidden from view. The boys were raised side by side, but their paths were set apart from the start. Franz Josef's bond with Ferdinand Max was the deepest and the most painful. Max had a joy for life that Franz lacked, and a questioning mind Franz had been taught to suppress. As boys, they were close. As men, they would drift apart, one to duty, the other to dreams. But the weight of their futures was already visible. While Ferdinand Max could dream, Franz Josef could only prepare. For one would sail seas, the other would carry an empire. Their father, Archduke Franz Karl, was present, but barely. Withdrawn, weak-willed, and dominated by Sophie, he played no real role in raising his children. Franz Josef would later speak of him with a kind of awkward respect, never affection. To the public, the family was picture-perfect. In reality, it was fractured. The boys were raised as princes, but separately. Their paths were diverging even in childhood. Only their mother Sophie stood as the axis around which all revolved. Her ambition for Franz Josef left little room for motherly affection. He was not her son, he was her project. She kept her gaze fixed on one goal, the throne, and that meant Franz Josef must be perfect. And so, while other boys played, Franz Josef studied. While other sons rebelled, he obeyed. And as Europe edged toward a storm, he simply kept marching, alone. Franz Josef didn't have a childhood. He had a curriculum. Every hour of every day was dictated by a strict schedule: languages, law, diplomacy, religion, and always military training. His tutors, hand-picked by Sophie, were often grizzled veterans, men shaped by war and obsessed with discipline. They instilled in him a vision of monarchy forged not by love, but by command. By the age of 13, he wore a uniform more often than casual dress. He saluted more than he smiled. Yet behind the drills and doctrines was a boy who was, at times, painfully lonely. His siblings came and went. His father, Franz Karl, remained distant and passive, but Sophie loomed over everything, the Empress in all but title. She whispered of duty and destiny, never of affection. Beyond the palace gates, the world was changing. The Industrial Revolution accelerated discontent. Intellectuals, liberals, students, they all began to whisper the same question: why should an empire of dozens of peoples be ruled by one ancient house? Franz Josef didn't yet grasp it, but the 1840s were not just his formative years. They were the empire's final calm before the storm. While Franz Josef drilled, read and obeyed, the world around him cracked open. Across the empire, things were changing. Too fast for Vienna, too slow for the people. The Industrial Revolution had come late to Austria, and unevenly. In the cities, factories rose. Smoke filled the air. A new working class grew restless, overworked, underpaid, unheard. In the countryside, poverty remained frozen in time. Serfdom had only recently ended. Peasants toiled on land they didn't own. They saw little reason to love the empire or those who ruled it. But worse than poverty was identity. Austria was a prison of nations. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Croats, Poles and more, all ruled by a distant court that demanded obedience, not understanding. In Hungary, calls for autonomy echoed louder every month. In Lombardy and Venice, Italian nationalists dreamed of freedom. And across the empire, liberal intellectuals whispered of constitutions, parliaments and press freedom, heresy to Metternich's world. To Franz Josef, still just a boy in uniform, the empire seemed eternal. But the old order, Metternich's order, was rotting beneath its golden facade, and somewhere deep inside he must have felt it. A storm was coming. In early 1848, the world Franz Josef had been groomed to serve, a world of divine right, rigid order, and noble duty, came crashing down. It began in February, in Paris. The French king, Louis-Philippe, was overthrown in a sudden uprising. News of it spread like a virus. Within days, the flames of revolution leapt across Europe: Berlin, Milan, Budapest, Prague, and Vienna. For a century, the Habsburg monarchy had leaned on one man to hold this chaos at bay: Prince Clemens von Metternich. Metternich had been Austria's master strategist since Napoleon's fall. He had designed the post-war order of Europe at the Congress of Vienna, a system built on censorship, secret police, and balance of power. He was the spider at the center of the conservative web. But in 1848 the web snapped. Riots broke out in the imperial capital. Protesters clashed with soldiers. The people demanded freedom of the press, a constitution, and an end to absolute monarchy. As gunfire rang out in the streets, Metternich, the iron architect of order, fled Vienna in disguise, escaping through a back door and over the border to England. The man who once dictated the fate of nations now slipped away like a criminal. With him went the illusion that the empire could resist change. Emperor Ferdinand I, Franz Josef's uncle, was 65 years old. Plagued by epilepsy and developmental delays, he had never been a true ruler. Decisions were made in his name, but never by him. In private, Franz Josef referred to him as Uncle Ferdi, with something like pity. When the empire demanded leadership, Ferdinand could offer none. His ministers panicked, his wife wept, the court fractured. It was Franz Josef's mother, Sophie, who took command. She gathered allies among the army, courtiers and conservative nobles, and in December of 1848 the impossible became inevitable. On December 2nd, Ferdinand abdicated the throne. His brother, Franz Josef's father, Franz Karl, was next in line, but he declined, pressured by Sophie. He was a mild, quiet man, unfit to rule in crisis. And so the crown skipped a generation. The boy who had once dressed as a miniature officer for imperial ceremonies now wore the crown for real. At the Hofburg Palace in Olmütz, surrounded by military pomp, he took the imperial oath. But there was no celebration, no triumph, just dread. He inherited not an empire, but a firestorm. The Habsburg lands were disintegrating. Hungary had declared independence. Northern Italy was in revolt. Vienna had been occupied by radicals and bombarded by the army. The revolution had not been crushed. It had only begun. And now all eyes turned to the teenage emperor, the last hope of the old world. Franz Joseph ascended the throne amid fire and chaos, an emperor not crowned in glory, but forged in crisis. At just 18, he inherited a crumbling empire, a fading dynasty, and a revolution already in full swing. The boy emperor now faced the impossible task of restoring order to a realm on the brink of collapse. Today, we follow the teenage emperor as he faces civil war, revolution, and learns that blood, not policy, will hold his empire together. But this is not a story of triumph. It's a story of violence, vengeance, and the seeds of future disaster. The abdication of Franz Josef's uncle, Emperor Ferdinand I, left the empire fractured. Revolutions ignited across Europe, spreading like wildfire. In Hungary, nationalists demanded independence. In Italy, revolts erupted against Austrian domination. And in Vienna, the heart of the empire, the revolution was in full swing, the streets flooded with protesters and rebels. And at the heart of this resistance stood his mother, Archduchess Sophie, the empire's true power behind the throne. Franz Josef, just a teenager, was thrust into the role of emperor in the midst of chaos. His early decisions would shape the future of the empire. He was faced with two choices: use brutal force to reassert control or attempt reforms to appease the masses. But Franz Josef was not ready for either. He was too young, too inexperienced. His psychological state was fragile, and his decisions were often driven by fear and insecurity. And yet, in that chaos, the new emperor stood firm. From his first days, Franz Josef made it clear he would not bend to the revolution. No constitution, no compromise. He would rule by divine right, just as his ancestors had. The message was brutal, and it was clear: the monarchy would survive, or it would fall fighting. Behind the scenes, it was his mother Sophie and her allies who held things together. Ministers loyal to the old order closed ranks. Generals returned to their posts. And slowly, the empire began to prepare for counterattack. Franz Josef would not negotiate with revolutionaries. He would crush them. By the spring of 1848, Vienna was in chaos. Barricades filled the streets, gunfire echoed through the city, and revolutionaries fought to topple the government. The Austrian military, led by Prince Windisch Gretz, laid siege to the city, hoping to crush the rebellion once and for all. But for Franz Josef, this wasn't just a siege. It was a battle for his soul, and for the soul of the empire. The young emperor watched as Vienna burned. His decision to use force was a pivotal moment in his reign. The siege of Vienna ended in bloodshed, but it also symbolized the emperor's determination to maintain his control. The reassertion of central authority came at a high price, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the legitimacy of the emperor himself. The use of military force against his own people deeply scarred the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects. Franz Josef had regained control, but the wounds were deep. Italy, too, was burning. In the spring of 1848, the Italian provinces of the Austrian Empire, Lombardy and Venetia, rose in open revolt. Milan, once the jewel of Austrian rule in the north, erupted in the famous 5 Days Uprising. Austrian garrisons were driven out by barricades and gunfire. The tricolour of Italian nationalism flew where the Habsburg eagle had once ruled. It was not just a local rebellion. The Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, under King Charles Alba, saw its moment. Italian unification was still a dream, but here was a chance to drive Austria out of the peninsula. Piedmont declared war on Austria, and the First Italian War of Independence had begun. Franz Joseph was still reeling from Vienna, from Hungary, from the weight of an empire slipping through his fingers. In the Italian theatre, he could only watch as his army collapsed under the pressure. The elderly Field Marshal Radetzky, commander of the Austrian forces in Italy, had retreated into the quadrilateral fortresses, defeated but not broken. And then, slowly, the tide turned. In March 1849, just 3 months after Franz Josef's coronation, Radetzky struck back. At the Battle of Novara, he crushed the Piedmontese army, forcing Charles Albert to abdicate in disgrace. Lombardy and Venetia were reoccupied. Venice held out under siege, proclaiming itself a republic, but by the end of summer it too fell. Austria had won. But it was a victory soaked in bitterness. Italy had been subdued, but not silenced. The tricolour had fallen, but the memory of resistance would haunt Austria for decades. Franz Josef's image in Italy was one of foreign tyranny. The repressive crackdown that followed only deepened the divide. Italian liberals and nationalists would never forget the blood spilled in Milan and Venice. For them, Austria was not a sovereign, it was a boot on their neck. And for Franz Josef, the Italian war was a warning. Nationalism could not be reasoned with. It could only be crushed. As Vienna smouldered, another fire burned across the empire, Hungary. Hungary wasn't just rebelling, it was declaring independence. Led by Lajos Kossuth, a gifted orator and fierce nationalist, the Hungarian Diet had formed its own government, raised its own army, and begun reshaping the country into a liberal state. At first, they claimed loyalty to the crown. But as Franz Josef rejected constitutionalism, Hungary broke away. For the emperor, this was treason. And for Austria, it was an existential threat. But suppressing Hungary was easier said than done. Field Marshal Windisch Gretz was dispatched to crush the rebellion. At first he made gains, retaking Pest in early 1849. But his victories were shallow. Hungarian forces, under the command of General Artur Gergely, regrouped fast. And unlike Austria's conscripts, Hungary's soldiers were fighting for their homeland. The war became brutal. Executions, scorched earth, and the shelling of civilian towns became routine. Each Austrian victory bred more resistance. Each defeat chipped away at imperial prestige. By spring, the Hungarian army had launched a full counter-offensive. Austria was losing, and Franz Josef, just months into his reign, faced a choice: compromise or escalate. He chose the latter and turned to a force that terrified even the revolutionaries. The Bear. He sent a desperate plea to Russia, begging for military assistance. In May 1849, he formally requested help from Tsar Nicholas. The justification was simple: solidarity among monarchs, and the fear of revolution spreading like wildfire. Nicholas agreed, not just to help Austria, but to crush liberalism itself. What followed was one of the largest foreign interventions in 19th-century Europe. Over 140,000 Russian troops flooded into Hungary. It was a message to revolutionaries across the continent. The old order was striking back. For Franz Josef, this was salvation and humiliation. His throne would be saved, but not by his own might. To many, the young emperor had sold Austria's pride for survival. Even his generals grumbled. But Franz Josef was resolute. In his eyes, empire came before ego. By August, the combined Austrian and Russian forces overwhelmed the Hungarians. General Gergely surrendered. The rebellion was over. The Russian army, known for its brutal tactics, played a decisive role in crushing the Hungarian rebels. Their hopes of independence shattered, and Russia had inserted itself as a powerful influence over the Austrian Empire, further undermining Franz Josef's legitimacy. Worse still, The fires of revolution had only been smothered, not extinguished. With the rebellions crushed, Franz Joseph now faced a different battlefield, one of vengeance, order, and fear. He turned to Baron Julius von Haynau, a general infamous for his brutality. Haynau earned a new name in Hungary, the Hangman of Arad. After 13 Hungarian generals were executed in a single day, thousands more revolutionaries were imprisoned, exiled, or conscripted into forced labor. Entire cities were put under martial law. The message was clear: resist the empire and pay with your blood. But this wasn't just punishment. It was a desperate attempt to reassert imperial control. Franz Joseph, barely 19, had seen his empire nearly dissolve before his eyes. Now he would rule with an iron fist. Across Europe, liberals recoiled. The Habsburg Empire had survived, but at the cost of its moral authority. Franz Joseph wasn't a liberator. He was a symbol of reaction, and worse still, the seeds of future rebellion had just been sown in blood. What followed wasn't peace, it was a silence enforced by the gallows. An iron decade of martial law and merciless repression, a period where Franz Joseph ruled with an iron fist, stifling any form of dissent and imposing harsh measures to keep the empire together. But the seeds of discontent had been sown, and while the empire may have survived the revolutions, it was clear that it would never be the same again. When Franz Joseph took the throne in 1848, he didn't inherit a kingdom. He inherited a graveyard of loyalty. The empire was stitched together from dozens of nationalities: Germans, Magyars, Czechs, Croats, Poles, Italians, Slovaks, Serbs, Romanians, each with their own dreams of nationhood. After the revolutions, none of them saw Vienna as their home, and worse, many now saw Franz Joseph as their jailer. In Hungary, he crowned himself without ever consulting the Hungarian Diet. No compromise, no consent. To them, he wasn't a king. He was an occupier wearing a stolen crown. Meanwhile, the Italian provinces seethed. Lombardy and Venetia had tasted rebellion, and they would rise again. Nationalism wasn't dying. It was simmering, waiting for its next moment. Franz Joseph ruled an empire, but it was an empire in name only, fractured, furious, and boiling just beneath the surface. He had won the war, but he had lost his people. Austria had survived. The revolutions were crushed, the empire restored, but what remained was not the same empire Franz Joseph had inherited. It was quieter now, but colder. An empire ruled by fear, bayonets, and the memory of chaos. And in saving his throne, Franz Joseph had saved his empire, but only by making a deal with the devil. And soon the devil would demand payment in Crimea. In 1853, war erupted once more in Europe, but this time Austria didn't join the fight, not in the trenches, not on the front lines. Instead, it stood on the sidelines, nervous, indecisive, alone. And in a war it never joined, Austria would lose everything. This is road to destruction, the world wars. Today we follow Franz Joseph, not through bloodshed, but through betrayal, a war of diplomacy, fear, and isolation, and how a grateful Tsar became a bitter enemy. The revolutions were crushed, the empire had survived, but in 1853 Austria was still haunted by the fires of 1848. The provinces had gone quiet, but not because they were loyal. They were silent because they were afraid. Franz Joseph's rule was absolute, but it was fragile. His empire rested on bayonets and prison walls, not on trust. And while the emperor wore his crown with pride, he knew the truth. His enemies hadn't vanished. They were just waiting. Then the Crimean War broke out. What started as a border dispute between Russia and the Ottoman Empire spiraled into something far greater. A war of empires, of alliances, of survival. Britain and France backed the Ottomans. Russia stood alone, and Austria, wedged between the West and the East, was caught in the middle. Just 4 years earlier, Franz Joseph had begged Russia for help, and Tsar Nicholas had answered. 140,000 Russian troops marched into Hungary, crushed the revolution, and saved Franz Joseph's crown. The Tsar had not asked for much in return, but now, with war on his doorstep, he expected loyalty. He wanted Austria to mobilize against the Ottomans, to repay the favor, man for man, blood for blood. But Franz Joseph hesitated. The Ottomans had not threatened Austria, and war meant risk, at home and abroad. Hungary still simmered. Italy still burned with nationalist dreams. Another war could ignite them all over again. So Austria made a choice, not a declaration of war, but a declaration of nothing, no troops, no alliance, no aid. Austria would remain neutral. But it was a neutrality with a knife hidden behind its back, a silence that spoke volumes to both sides. In 1854, Austria moved troops to its border with Russia, not to help, but to warn. It issued an ultimatum: withdraw from the Danubian principalities, or face Austrian force. Russia, already bleeding in Crimea, had no choice. It retreated, humiliated, and for Tsar Nicholas, the betrayal was complete. Austria, once a brother in monarchy, had abandoned him when he needed it most. The Tsar's words were scathing: "I saved the Habsburg throne, and they repay me with ingratitude." From that moment, a crack formed, not just between monarchs, but between empires. Austria had chosen diplomacy, but what it really chose was isolation. By the end of the Crimean War, Russia was defeated. France and Britain stood triumphant. And Austria? Austria was alone. Russia, its former savior, now considered it a traitor. France and Britain, who had gained the upper hand, saw Austria not as an ally, but as an opportunist. No one trusted Vienna, not the East, not the West. Franz Joseph had avoided war, but he had paid a steep price. He had destroyed his alliances and gained nothing in return. He wasn't feared like Prussia. He wasn't admired like France. He was ignored. And worse still, he had earned the quiet contempt of Europe's great powers. Austria wasn't feared, it wasn't respected, it was tolerated. And for an empire once proud, once central to European politics, that was the deepest humiliation of all. Austria had survived revolution, only to be abandoned in peace. Franz Joseph had secured his throne through Russian bayonets, and then broken the hand that had held him up. By 1856, the empire was adrift, friendless, fearful, and heading toward something far worse. Because Italy hadn't forgotten 1848, and soon the flame of Italian nationalism would rise again. Only this time, the world would not stand aside. And Austria? It would find itself dragged into a war it could not win. The First Italian War of Independence had ended in 1849 with Austrian victory. Field Marshal Radetzky's crushing of the Piedmontese at Novara had reasserted imperial control over Lombardy and Venetia. Venice fell later that year, but as we saw, it was a victory soaked in bitterness, and one that left behind deep scars. In the decade that followed, Austria imposed martial law in its Italian provinces. Censorship was total. Dissenters were jailed, executed, or exiled. The emperor's rule rested on bayonets and surveillance. Franz Joseph viewed Italy not as a province to be reformed, but as a threat to be managed. He saw nationalism not as a political movement, but as a cancer, one that had to be cut out again and again. The repression was meant to restore order, but it had the opposite effect. Every crackdown deepened resentment. Every execution widened the divide. Italy was not quiet. It was simmering. And outside Austria, powerful forces were watching, waiting for the moment to strike. Chief among them, the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. Though defeated, it had not been destroyed. In fact, after the humiliation of 1849, Piedmont began to transform politically, militarily, and diplomatically. The rise of Count Camillo de Cavour, a master of statecraft, and Victor Emmanuel II, a monarch willing to gamble everything for unification, created a new kind of threat to Austria, one more sophisticated, more subtle, and far more dangerous. And behind Piedmont stood a new and eager ally, France. In the 1850s, Austria found itself increasingly isolated on the European stage. Its actions during the Crimean War, a tepid stance that alienated both Russia and France, had left it without friends. Britain no longer trusted Vienna. Russia felt betrayed. And Napoleon III, Emperor of the French, had his own ambitions in Italy. The diplomatic tide was shifting. But Franz Joseph didn't see it. Or rather, he didn't want to. Ever since the revolutions of 1848, Franz Joseph had retreated inward, emotionally and politically. His worldview was rigid, his trust limited, and his approach to Italy unchanged. The emperor still believed that authority came from above, from God, through him. He still saw concessions as weakness. He still believed that loyalty could be commanded through force. It was a delusion, and it was about to be exposed. When Cavour met secretly with Napoleon III at Plombières in 1858, the stage was set. France would support Piedmont in a war against Austria, in exchange for territory in return. The goal: drive Austria out of Italy and pave the way for unification. Austria, of course, saw none of this coming. Franz Joseph dismissed the diplomatic rumblings as noise. He believed his empire was strong. His army was ready, and the Italians, still reeling from 1848, would never dare rise again. He was wrong. In early 1859, tensions escalated. Piedmont began mobilizing troops. Austria demanded a halt. But it was all theater. Cavour wanted war. Napoleon needed glory. And Franz Joseph, despite all signs, gave them exactly what they wanted. He issued an ultimatum. When it was rejected, Austria mobilized its army and invaded Piedmont. The Second Italian War of Independence had begun. For the first time in his life, Franz Joseph would take the field himself, not as a distant ruler, but as commander-in-chief. But the reality of war was far crueler than his romantic notions. The Austrian army, though large, was outdated, its command structure bloated, its tactics relics of a bygone age, and its soldiers, poorly motivated, drawn from dozens of ethnicities, had little loyalty to the emperor or his cause. France and Piedmont, by contrast, had a modernized, mobile army. Their generals were competent, their morale high, and their cause, Italian unity, inspired those they marched to liberate. Austria's initial advance was slow, bogged down by poor logistics and muddled leadership. Franz Joseph quickly found himself overwhelmed. The emperor, though determined, had no real experience. His orders were often confusing. His presence did not inspire. It unsettled. The decisive blow came in June at the Battle of Magenta. The Battle of Magenta was chaos. French and Sardinian forces, better coordinated and aggressively led, outmaneuvered the Austrians. Streets turned into slaughterhouses, units became isolated, communication collapsed, and Franz Joseph, watching from the rear, could do little but witness the unraveling of his army. The defeat was stunning, but worse was yet to come. At Solferino, just weeks later, the full scale of Austria's collapse was revealed. Over 300,000 men clashed in a brutal day-long engagement that saw the Austrian line disintegrate under repeated French assaults. He was only 29 years old, a young emperor commanding a crumbling army, watching his empire bleed. Bodies piled in ditches, screams of the dying echoing across the fields, medics overwhelmed. The emperor, who had once believed in the righteous glory of battle, now saw only its horror. It was his first and last experience of war. After Solferino, he retreated, not just physically but emotionally. Austria sued for peace. Franz Joseph, shaken, humiliated and grieving for the loss of both territory and pride, accepted terms that saw Lombardy ceded to France and then to Piedmont. The empire had lost its crown jewel in Italy, and Franz Joseph had lost something far more personal, his belief that he could save the empire by force. For Franz Joseph, the defeat in Italy was more than a political setback. It was an existential crisis. He had marched to war believing in his divine right, believing that discipline and duty would prevail, that the old order could still hold, that he, as emperor, had the strength to preserve what his ancestors had built. But Italy had proven otherwise. The defeat shattered his confidence. He withdrew from the public. His court grew colder, more insular. The rigidity of his rule hardened, and the distance between emperor and people grew ever wider. In private, he blamed the generals, the army, even God. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was his war, his command, his failure, and yet, rather than change course, he doubled down. Austria would retreat inward. Reform was off the table. Nationalism would be met with greater repression. Concessions were treason. Compromise was surrender. Italy, he believed, was lost not because Austria was wrong, but because the world had changed, and that change terrified him. The loss of Lombardy was not just a blow to Austrian pride, it was a strategic disaster. It exposed the empire's southern flank, it emboldened nationalist movements across Europe, and it revealed, for all to see, that the Habsburg Colossus was hollow. Within Italy, the dream of unification was now real. Sardinia had emerged as a leader of that cause. France had proven willing to act, and Austria, once the enforcer of reaction, had shown itself vulnerable. Within the empire, other nationalities took notice. Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, and Poles all saw the cracks in the imperial foundation. And outside Austria, one man watched with interest: Otto von Bismarck. From the sidelines, Bismarck saw the Italian defeat as proof that Austria was no longer invincible, that the empire could be challenged and beaten. The stage was being set, not just for Italian unification, but for a deeper, more deadly rivalry. Austria had survived 1848. It had survived Hungary. It had survived the Crimean fallout. But it would not survive another war like this. And that war was coming. After the defeat, Franz Joseph returned to Vienna a different man, older, colder, angrier. He had walked into Italy a monarch. He returned a relic, but still he refused to change. His ideology, the divine right, the iron fist, the central state, remained intact. He clung to absolutism like a man clinging to a lifeline. Reformers were sidelined, nationalist demands ignored, the army rebuilt, but without reflection. Austria doubled down on control, not innovation, on tradition, not progress. It was a tragic misreading of the moment, because the world was changing rapidly. Italy was moving toward unification, Germany was stirring, liberalism was gaining strength across Europe, and Austria, rigid, backward, paranoid, was slowly becoming a fossil in the age of steam and steel. And at the center of it all stood Franz Joseph, not a villain, not a tyrant, but a man out of time. The war in Italy had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. Austria had lost Lombardy, but it had also lost something deeper: its aura of invincibility, its grip on its provinces, its confidence, and Franz Joseph had lost a piece of himself. From this point forward, he would rule not with hope, but with fear. But far to the north, in the kingdom of Prussia, another monarch was watching. And beside him a rising force, brilliant, ruthless, calculating, was taking notes: Otto von Bismarck. He had watched Austria's humiliation, and he had plans of his own. In the shadows of Europe's great empires, a quiet contest was beginning to boil. The Austrian Empire, once the guardian of conservative order, still bore the scars of revolution and humiliation. And its emperor, Franz Joseph, just 29, carried those scars with stoic resignation. But a storm was gathering to the north. Prussia, once a fragmented kingdom living in Austria's diplomatic shadow, had found its steel. And behind its rise stood two men, Wilhelm I, the old soldier king, and Otto von Bismarck, the cunning statesman whose very presence seemed to crack the diplomatic balance of Europe. Franz Josef had come of age in a world shaken by revolt. He had outlived the chaos of 1848, crushed rebellion, and survived diplomatic isolation. But as the 1860s dawned, the game was no longer about survival. It was about supremacy. And the man waiting in the wings, Bismarck, had no intention of playing fair. This is the story of a rivalry that would shape a continent, the uneasy dance between Austria and Prussia, between tradition and ambition, between a faltering emperor and a master of realpolitik. Franz Josef had been crowned amid the flames of revolution. A boy king thrust onto the throne of a crumbling empire. He had stood firm while the streets of Vienna echoed with the cry for change. But that defiance came at a cost. The revolutions of 1848 had shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility. Though Austria survived, it did so through blood and repression. Franz Josef, hardened by necessity, began his reign not as a beloved monarch, but as a bulwark against chaos. He was 18, isolated, and already burdened with the weight of preservation. Across the German states, Prussia faced its own turmoil. In Berlin, the monarchy was threatened, yet unlike Austria, Prussia held. Prussia embraced reform where it had to, reinforced its military where it could, and slowly began to position itself not as Austria's junior partner, but as its rival. Wilhelm, who would one day become emperor, remained a steady force. At his side was a younger, sharp-tongued aristocrat named Otto von Bismarck, who even then showed signs of something far more dangerous, a vision. Franz Josef, still a teenager, observed these men from afar. Wilhelm was older, composed, a man who had survived the storm. And Bismarck, ruthless, cunning, and defiant, was everything Franz Josef feared he could never be. Austria had put down its revolutions through brutal force. Prussia had managed something else, control. Austria had enforced obedience. Prussia had forged unity. To Franz Josef, these men, Wilhelm and Bismarck, must have appeared almost mythical, older, experienced, and somehow untouched by the scars that marked him. Wilhelm had emerged stronger from the storm of 1848, while Franz Josef felt increasingly embattled and alone. It was during this period that Franz first began to notice Bismarck. Then merely a diplomat and provocateur, Bismarck's writings and speeches hinted at a dangerous intelligence, one unconcerned with Vienna's conventions. He was a man who would tear up treaties and traditions alike to secure Prussia's future. And as Franz Josef watched Europe shift around him, the figure of Bismarck lingered, menacing, calculating, and increasingly impossible to ignore. The Second Italian War of Independence in 1859 marked the beginning of Austria's slow unraveling and Prussia's opportunity. France and Sardinia tore through Lombardy, and Austria suffered a humiliating defeat that shook its prestige to the core. Franz Josef had led his army in person, desperate to assert his authority, but the war ended in retreat and disgrace. The defeat did not go unnoticed in Berlin. Bismarck, then Prussia's ambassador to Russia, sent dispatches that bristled with opportunity. Austria was bleeding. Her empire, held together by brittle alliances and ethnic suppression, had revealed its cracks. It was not a question of if Austria would fall, but when and to whom. Franz Josef, by contrast, recoiled from change. Reform was synonymous with disorder in his mind. Even as liberalism and nationalism surged through the continent, Austria dug deeper into absolutism. Franz saw himself not as a creator of history, but its custodian, a tragic defender of a divine order increasingly out of step with reality. As the 1860s opened, the rivalry began to take shape in earnest. Prussia and Austria both vied for influence within the German Confederation. Diplomatic meetings became minefields, and every statement from Bismarck seemed laced with hidden menace. Franz Joseph, still clinging to a vision of German brotherhood under Habsburg leadership, increasingly found himself playing defense. Franz Joseph watched from Vienna as Bismarck returned home and took control as minister-president in 1862. It was a quiet coup. With iron determination, Bismarck silenced dissent within the Prussian parliament, modernized the army, and ignored the constitutional crisis that might have undone a lesser man. But even before this, he had begun to lay the ideological groundwork for Prussia's ascension. He spoke openly of German unity, not under the Habsburgs, but under Prussian leadership. To Franz Joseph, the contrast was painful. At 29, he was still trying to keep his empire stitched together, nationalities at each other's throats, the military overstretched, and Vienna's court plagued by inertia. But Bismarck was ascending. He had seized power with confidence, and worst of all, he seemed to know what he was doing. But then came a crisis that neither empire could ignore, one that would draw them into an uneasy alliance, and then into inevitable conflict. In 1863, the King of Denmark died without a clear heir to the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, territories inhabited by both Germans and Danes. The question of who would control them became known as the Schleswig-Holstein question, a diplomatic puzzle so convoluted that even Lord Palmerston joked that only 3 men had ever understood it, and 2 of them were dead. When Denmark attempted to integrate Schleswig into its kingdom, it provoked outrage across the German states. Bismarck saw a chance not only to bolster Prussia's prestige, but to test Austria's resolve. He proposed a joint military action, inviting Austria to participate in the invasion. Franz Joseph agreed. He likely saw it as a chance to mend the rift between their 2 empires, to assert Austrian leadership in German affairs once more. But Bismarck had no such intentions. The war, he knew, would only deepen the rift. The campaign itself was a success. Danish resistance was swiftly crushed, and both duchies fell under joint Austro-Prussian control. But the victory quickly turned sour. The joint administration of the duchies quickly broke down. Prussia took Schleswig, Austria oversaw Holstein, but Bismarck, with subtle provocations and careful legal maneuvering, stirred unrest in the Austrian-held territory. Franz Joseph was caught in a bind. He could not allow Bismarck to expand Prussian influence unchecked, but neither could he risk outright war. His advisors were divided. The army was not ready. His empire was still licking its wounds from Italy, yet doing nothing would mean irrelevance. Worse still, Franz Joseph could see it. Bismarck was maneuvering him into a corner. In Vienna, the emperor found himself increasingly isolated. He confided in few. His wife, Elisabeth, Sisi, grew distant, traveling constantly to escape the suffocating court. The weight of the monarchy pressed down on him like never before. Bismarck, the man he once saw as a stabilizing force, now appeared as a predator circling its prey. Still, Franz Joseph made his decision. Austria would not back down. If Bismarck wanted Holstein, he would have to take it by force. Franz Joseph, once again, had been outplayed. Though the Second Schleswig War had been a success militarily, it revealed something deeper within Franz Joseph, a profound sense of isolation. The emperor had not led the army in person. He had learned from 1859. But he was deeply involved in every strategic decision. He hoped that victory would restore Austria's pride and reset the balance with Prussia. Instead, it had emboldened Bismarck. Franz Josef's letters from this period reflect a man increasingly aware of his own limits. He wrote not of glory, but of burden, of victories that turned to sand, and a duty that grew heavier with each passing year. "We win battles," he once said, "but lose the future." He had begun to see Bismarck not merely as a rival, but as a symbol of a different world, a modern world, ruled not by divine right, but by willpower and cunning. Where Franz still clung to legitimacy and tradition, Bismarck forged his path through manipulation and threat, and yet Franz Josef could not change course. He had been raised to believe in stability above all else. His rule was a monument to continuity. To embrace Bismarck's methods would be to betray everything he stood for. That paralysis, his inability to adapt, became the tragedy of his reign. In the months after the Second Schleswig War, Austria found itself in a dangerous limbo. Victory had brought no unity, only division. The German Confederation was fracturing, and Austria's leadership within it was openly challenged by Prussia's aggressive moves. Bismarck now moved openly. He signed a secret military alliance with Italy, promising them Venetia in exchange for support in a future conflict. Meanwhile, he worked to ensure neutrality from France and Russia, making Austria more isolated than ever. The trap was nearly sprung. Franz Josef tried to rally support among the German states, but he faced growing skepticism. Bavaria, Saxony, and others feared Prussian expansion, but they also saw Austria as weak and indecisive. The Emperor's appeals to tradition and brotherhood rang hollow in a world growing colder and more pragmatic. Internally, the empire was strained. Nationalist movements simmered beneath the surface, and military reforms lagged behind those of Prussia. Franz Josef, ever dutiful, pressed forward. But there was a sense of inevitability hanging over Vienna. The empire he sought to preserve had become a relic, and Bismarck knew it. And so, Austria and Prussia stood at the precipice of war. Franz Josef had reached the limits of diplomacy. The Schleswig crisis had shattered any illusion of partnership. Bismarck had played his hand brilliantly, dragging Austria into conflict on terms of his choosing. What had begun as cooperation against Denmark had become a bitter rivalry for the soul of Germany. For Bismarck, this was the next step in a master plan. For Franz Josef, it was the last chance to salvage his empire's dignity. As armies marched and telegrams flew, Franz Josef watched the storm gather from the Hofburg Palace. He had hoped to delay destruction, but the wheels of history were turning. He was only 34 now, but he felt older, tired, alone. The next battle would not be a diplomatic skirmish or a regional dispute. It would be a reckoning, a war that would decide the future of Europe, and Prussia was coming. In 1864, Austria and Prussia had fought together to seize these territories from Denmark, but after the victory, they quickly quarreled over the spoils. Austria took Holstein, Prussia, Schleswig. It was a delicate arrangement, but Bismarck never intended it to last. Franz Josef was only 35 when war with Prussia erupted, still young by monarchical standards, but aged far beyond his years. When he took the throne at 18, he believed in duty, divine right, and the unshakable strength of the Habsburg Empire. But those beliefs had been chipped away by the revolutions of 1848, by defeats in Italy, and by betrayal after betrayal on the international stage. Now, as the summer of 1866 approached, he found himself once again at the brink of war. In Berlin, Wilhelm I, nearly 70, still radiated strength. His kingdom was smaller, but his position was surer. At his side stood Otto von Bismarck, now 51, holding the reins of Prussian power with ruthless precision. These men had also emerged from the fires of 1848. But where they had grown confident, Franz Josef had grown cautious, wounded, isolated. He had spent 2 decades trying to hold his empire together through sheer will. But now, it was slipping away, one province, one alliance, one hope at a time. He didn't trust Bismarck, not for a second. He had seen the Prussian diplomat manipulate events in Schleswig-Holstein and outmaneuver Austria in the German Confederation, but even with that distrust, he could not fully comprehend what was coming. Bismarck goaded Austria into conflict, provoking with policies, arrests and troop movements. At the same time, he built diplomatic cover, striking understandings with Russia and France to ensure Prussia would not be isolated. He even made overtures to Italy, and that proved decisive. Italy had long thirsted for Venetia, still under Austrian control. To most Italians, it was the final piece of their national puzzle, a lingering symbol of Austrian domination and humiliation. Bismarck offered them a deal. If Italy joined Prussia in the event of war, they would receive Venetia. Italy accepted immediately. Austria now faced the prospect of a two-front war. Prussia in the north, Italy in the south. Franz Joseph was cornered. He appealed to the German Confederation for support, but Bismarck struck first, declaring the Confederation dissolved and accusing Austria of violating their joint administration of Holstein. Austria tried to rally the smaller German states, Saxony, Bavaria, Hanover, but even these alliances were shaky. Some were half-hearted, others distrusted Vienna nearly as much as Berlin. And Franz Joseph, he was once again watching his world unravel, not from revolution, but from the very system he had long defended, German unity. Franz Joseph did not want this war. He understood what it could mean for the empire, but he also believed that to do nothing would invite national humiliation and disintegration from within. So he gave the order. Austria would fight. Troops marched north to Bohemia and south to defend against Italy. The empire's armies were stretched thin across multiple fronts, pulled across a patchwork of loyalties and languages. On paper, Austria's military still looked formidable. Over 400,000 soldiers, dozens of regiments, an imperial legacy of discipline and prestige. But beneath the numbers, there was rot. The army was poorly coordinated, supplies mismanaged. Communication between high command and frontline generals often collapsed. Worst of all, the army lacked unity of purpose. Hungarian units were often unenthusiastic. Slavic regiments distrusted their officers. German Austrians resented the Italians, and the Italians despised Vienna. Franz Joseph, ever the traditionalist, still clung to belief in divine justice and monarchical strength, but those beliefs could not organize a modern war, and Prussia was about to demonstrate what modern war really looked like. Italy's entry into the war was driven by ambition and resentment. The unification movement had made huge strides since 1859, but Venetia remained under foreign control. Nationalists saw it as a stain on sovereignty. Austria's earlier defeats only whetted their appetite. When Bismarck offered a deal, Italy did not hesitate.
In June 1866, Italy declared war. The southern front exploded. For Franz Joseph, it was a nightmare. In the north, a rising Prussia threatened his influence. In the south, a once backwater kingdom was now claiming its place and striking for stolen lands. The emperor wrote in despair to his ministers. "Every front is a wound," he said. "We are bleeding from every corner of the empire." Austrian troops under Archduke Albrecht managed to hold the line in the south, even winning a victory at Custoza. And on July 20th, the Austrian navy under Admiral Tegethoff won a stunning victory at Lissa, defeating a larger Italian fleet. But the war had already moved beyond individual battles. Because in the north, Prussia was on the march. It had a professional general staff led by Helmuth von Moltke. It had a rail network to move troops rapidly. It had the needle gun, a breech-loading rifle that fired faster than anything Austria had. Moltke's plans were precise. Within days, Prussian armies stormed into Bohemia, outmaneuvering Austria's larger but slower forces. Everywhere Austria fought, it was a step behind. Troops stumbled into battle without full supply. Orders arrived late. Strategy turned to guesswork. Meanwhile, in the south, Italy launched its offensive from Lombardy, hoping to seize Venetia. Their army was large, but clumsy and poorly led. They suffered a disastrous defeat at Custoza. But the damage was done. Austria had been forced to divert tens of thousands of troops to the Italian front, men who might have made the difference in Bohemia. Then came Königgrätz.
On July 3rd, 1866, nearly 400,000 men clashed in Bohemia, one of the largest battles in European history up to that point. Austria, under General Ludwig von Benedek, had taken a defensive position, but the Prussians, using superior coordination and timing, attacked from multiple sides. The battle raged for hours. Austrian cannon thundered across the hills. Prussian infantry advanced relentlessly. The needle gun tore through Austrian ranks like lightning. By day's end, Austria's army was shattered. Over 40,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a collapse. Franz Joseph wasn't on the battlefield, but he felt every blow. The defeat shattered Austria's prestige in Germany. The myth of Austrian invincibility, born in the age of Metternich and the Habsburgs, was gone. The emperor, once the first German prince, now stood outside the gates of German unity, shivering in the cold. News of the defeat reached Vienna swiftly. Franz Joseph received it in silence. For hours he paced the halls of the Hofburg. No tears, no speeches, just the weight of realization. He had lost the leadership of Germany. The old order was gone. In private, he admitted as much to his inner circle. Austria could no longer dictate the fate of the German peoples. That destiny now lay with Berlin. The humiliation was complete. The war ended almost as swiftly as it had begun. After Königgrätz, Austria had little choice but to seek peace. Its army was broken, its prestige in tatters, its emperor staring into the ruins of his hopes. The old order, his order, had been crushed in the fields of Bohemia. Yet the terms of surrender were not as brutal as they might have been, not because of Austrian strength, but because of Prussian restraint. Otto von Bismarck, ruthless though he was also pragmatic. He knew that stability in Central Europe required balance, not obliteration. He reined in the hawkish instincts of King Wilhelm, who wanted to march on Vienna and impose total victory. Bismarck refused. He saw no reason to punish Austria excessively or shatter the European equilibrium. What mattered most was simple: expel Austria from German affairs. Permanently. And so in August 1866, the Treaty of Prague was signed. It marked the end of the Austro-Prussian War and the end of Austria's centuries-long leadership in the German world. The treaty's terms were deceptively simple, but devastating in their implications. Austria was formally excluded from all German political matters. Its identity as a great German power, an identity nurtured since the Middle Ages, was erased overnight. The old German Confederation was dissolved. In its place, Prussia began forming the North German Confederation, a proto-empire that had no role for Vienna. Several German states that had sided with Austria, like Hanover, Hesse-Kassel and Nassau, were annexed directly into Prussia. They would no longer answer to their own princes, let alone to the Habsburg emperor. But perhaps the most bitter loss came in the south. Austria was forced to surrender Venetia to Italy. The transfer was mediated through Napoleon III of France, a fig leaf for Austrian pride. But the truth was plain. Austria had bled for those lands, fought for them in earlier wars against Sardinia and France, and now they were gone. Italy had been humiliated at Custoza and Lissa, but thanks to Prussia's triumph in the north, it walked away with a prize it could never have taken alone. Franz Joseph had lost both Germany and northern Italy in a single crushing blow. Two pillars of the Habsburg legacy, gone. But the deepest wound wasn't territorial. It was personal, existential. Franz Joseph was not merely a ruler of lands. In his mind and in the ideology of his empire, he was the heir to Charlemagne, to the Holy Roman Emperors, to centuries of Christian monarchy and German unity. He had seen himself as the guardian of a sacred order stretching back 1,000 years. Now, that illusion lay in ruins. With Austria expelled from Germany and Venetia lost, the emperor stood more isolated than ever. His armies had failed him, his generals had failed him. Even his belief in divine favor seemed to falter. The war hadn't just defeated Austria, it had unmoored it. The empire that once anchored Central Europe now drifted, rejected by the peoples it once led, encircled by stronger, more confident rivals. Franz Joseph returned to Vienna not as a victorious monarch, but as a chastened survivor. Behind the gilded walls of the Hofburg Palace, he bore his grief in silence. He wrote fewer letters. He walked the halls more slowly. He still wore the uniform and the moustache of an emperor, but he moved like a man cut off from history, unsure what future remained. He was only 36, but the war had aged him far more than time ever could. Austria was no longer a German empire, nor was it an Italian power. It had become something else, something smaller, more fragile, more anxious. A relic in a world rushing toward modern nation-states and steel diplomacy. And Franz Joseph, for all his resilience, now ruled a state adrift. But even in defeat, he would not yield. The empire still lived, somehow. And now he would do whatever it took to preserve what remained. The old Austria was dead. But something new would have to be born, quickly, or the empire itself would follow it into the grave. Within the empire, the aftershocks were seismic. Hungarians, long restless, now demanded real autonomy. Slavic nationalists saw the defeat as a sign of Vienna's weakness. Even conservative Austrians began to question whether Franz Joseph's absolute rule was still viable. The empire's divisions, long papered over by military prestige and monarchical grandeur, were now laid bare. Franz Joseph, the centralizing force of his empire, now faced a reckoning. The model he had ruled by, hierarchy, command, imperial pride, was no longer viable. Something had to give. But Franz Joseph was not done. There was still an empire to rule, if he could hold it together. Even in this moment of despair, he made a choice that would shape the future. He chose to adapt, reluctantly, painfully, but definitively. To save the empire, Franz Joseph would have to share it. In the rubble of war, a strange opportunity emerged. Austria had lost its German identity. Its Italian territories were gone. But its Hungarian lands, still restless, still angry since the 1848 crackdowns, remained. Now, with defeat fresh and prestige gone, Franz Joseph had no choice but to compromise. In the aftermath of defeat, silence fell over Vienna. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that lingers after something vital has been lost. In the Hofburg Palace, the air was heavy with shame and exhaustion. Maps lay unrolled on long tables, but their borders were no longer Franz Joseph's to draw. The emperor had not only lost a war, he had lost Austria's place in the heart of Europe. The year was 1866. The empire was broken, its illusions shattered at Königgrätz, its armies limping home, its people bitter and bewildered. Prussia now stood at the head of the German world. Italy had taken Venetia. Austria's prestige was in ruins. Franz Joseph, at 36, felt older than ever. The dreams of unity and dominance that had sustained the Habsburgs for centuries were crumbling before his eyes. But he did not weep. He did not rage. He endured, because he had no other choice. The war was lost. The empire had to be saved. But the old tools no longer worked. The levers of imperial control had rusted. The authority that once commanded loyalty now bred resentment. Across the empire, murmurs of rebellion grew louder, especially from Hungary. Hungary had never forgiven, not the suppression of 1848, not the execution of its leaders, not the long years of martial law and censorship. And now, with Austria humbled, Hungarian leaders saw their moment. They would no longer bow to Vienna. If the empire wished to survive, it would have to change. In Budapest, the nationalist Count Gyula Andrassy had risen from exile and silence to become the voice of compromise and the guardian of Hungarian dignity. He spoke for a generation that had tasted revolution and remembered the gallows. But he was no romantic. He saw clearly this was not a time for vengeance, but opportunity. Austria was weak. Hungary was restless. The only way forward was together. But that union would not come easy. Trust was a foreign currency in the Habsburg lands. Franz Joseph had once crushed Hungary with an iron fist. Now he would have to offer an open hand. The proposal was unprecedented. 2 crowns, 1 emperor. Austria and Hungary would be co-equal halves of a single empire, united in foreign affairs, defense and dynastic loyalty, but separate in law, government and national identity. Hungary would regain its own parliament, its own ministries, its own voice. For Franz Joseph it was unthinkable, and yet it was necessary. He wrestled with the idea for months. The thought of yielding imperial authority gnawed at his soul. He was, after all, a monarch raised in the shadow of divine right. To compromise felt like sacrilege, but the reality of defeat had left him with no other option. In private, he told his advisers, "Better to bend than to break." In early 1867, negotiations accelerated. Behind closed doors, Austrian and Hungarian delegations debated the fine lines of sovereignty, the balance of power, the symbolism of unity. Franz Joseph was involved in every step. He studied documents late into the night, scribbling notes in his own hand. He questioned ministers sharply, pushed back on concessions, agonized over each clause. But something in him had shifted. Gone was the impetuous youth who had refused to negotiate with rebels. In his place stood a man tempered by war, by grief, and by the slow erosion of imperial certainty. On February 17th, 1867, the dam broke. Franz Joseph appointed Count Andrassy as Minister-President of Hungary, a symbolic and practical recognition of the new arrangement. It was a moment unthinkable just a few years before. Andrassy, once sentenced to death in absentia by the Emperor's regime, was now his partner in power. The final settlement, known as the Ausgleich, compromise, was ratified in May, and with it, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was born. It was not a birth of joy, but of necessity. 2 parliaments, 2 governments, 2 capitals, but 1 army, 1 foreign policy, 1 emperor. Franz Joseph now wore 2 crowns, Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. To his critics, it was an admission of failure. To his supporters, it was a masterstroke of survival. To Franz Joseph, it was both. He traveled to Budapest that summer for the official coronation. The city was decorated in gold and crimson. Church bells rang, and the streets overflowed with cheering crowds. But behind the smiles and ceremony lay decades of bitterness. The emperor rode in silence through the throng. His face, solemn and unreadable, bore the weight of history. He entered Matthias Church not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant seeking peace. Inside, he knelt. The crown of St. Stephen was lowered onto his head. And with that gesture, centuries of Habsburg dominance gave way to a fragile new partnership. That moment marked the high point of the compromise. But beneath the surface, the new empire remained uneasy. The Ausgleich had solved one problem, but revealed many more. What of the Slavs, the Czechs, the Croats, the Romanians, the Serbs? They saw no dual monarchy in this arrangement, only a binary one, where Germans and Magyars shared power while others remained subjects. In Prague and Zagreb, the whispers began, "Why not us?" Nationalists accused Franz Joseph of playing favorites, of trading one form of absolutism for another, of rebuilding the empire not as a union of peoples, but as a pact between elites. The emperor knew the dangers, but he saw no alternative. Hungary had to be brought back into the imperial fold, and to do that he had to offer something real. The Slavs, he reasoned, could wait. Their time would come. But that was a dangerous assumption. The empire was now a patchwork of identities. Austrians, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Ukrainians, Romanians, Italians, Jews, each with its own language, religion, memory, and resentment. The compromise had preserved the empire, but it had also locked it into a fragile balancing act. And Franz Josef stood at the center. He became a symbol more than a ruler, the glue of the empire, the face that greeted soldiers and schoolchildren alike. His portrait hung in classrooms from Trieste to Transylvania. His name was spoken with reverence or with frustration, but always with recognition. He ruled from Vienna, but governed two worlds, and in his heart he knew what the compromise had cost. It had preserved the empire, but shrunk its soul. Gone was the dream of a united German realm under Habsburg guidance. Gone was the hope of restoring lost prestige in Italy. What remained was a bruised empire stitched together with compromise and caution. But still, it endured. The 1870s dawned with a kind of wary stability. The empire slowly modernized. Railroads extended across the provinces. Industry took root in Bohemia and Galicia. Budapest blossomed into a vibrant metropolis. Vienna remained a cultural jewel. And Franz Josef, older and more withdrawn, kept his watch. He rarely showed emotion. His routines were rigid. He rose early, worked relentlessly and trusted few. But he remained above all committed. Committed to the idea that the Habsburg Empire, though battered, still had a role to play. The Compromise of 1867 was his greatest concession and his greatest achievement. It bought time, it bought peace. It allowed Austria-Hungary to enter the last decades of the 19th century, not as a relic, but as a living, if fragile, state. But the contradictions remained. Every success bred new tensions. Every reform demanded more. And in the shadows of the imperial court, those contradictions began to whisper louder. What had been postponed in 1867 would not be resolved so easily. The Compromise of 1867 saved the empire, but it did not heal it. Austria and Hungary now shared a throne, a military and a monarch, but not a vision. Beneath the surface of this carefully balanced dual monarchy, old wounds festered and new rivalries simmered. While Vienna and Budapest stood tall, the voices from Prague, Zagreb and Sarajevo grew louder, asking the same question: where is our place in this empire? Franz Josef had bought time, but at a cost, because in holding the center, he had only postponed the unraveling at the edges. But while Austria tried to heal, the world around it changed. Just 4 years later, in the glittering Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire was born, united, confident, and everything Austria was not. Bismarck's victory had carved a new power into the heart of Europe, and Austria-Hungary, it remained a puzzle of peoples, ruled by compromise and held together by one aging emperor. This is road to destruction, the world wars. The year was 1867, and Franz Josef stood crowned in two capitals, one crown for Austria, another for Hungary. One empire split down the spine. The compromise had stitched the monarchy back together, but like all emergency surgery, it left scars. Outwardly, the empire stood tall. The parades in Vienna dazzled. The ceremonies in Budapest stirred national pride. Maps were redrawn, ministries restructured, and the emperor's portrait now hung in every schoolhouse from the Adriatic to the Carpathians. On paper, Austria-Hungary was reborn, a modern dual monarchy ready to march into the future. But beneath the gilded surface, fractures spread. The compromise had been a political miracle, but a social gamble. It bound two proud nations together, Austrians and Hungarians, while leaving everyone else in the waiting room. The Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Poles, Ukrainians and Italians watched the birth of the dual monarchy not with celebration, but with suspicion. For them there had been no compromise, only exclusion. And so, from its first breath, the dual monarchy was not a house united, but a house divided. Franz Josef understood this. In fact, he feared it. Though he had approved the compromise with grim resolve, he knew it was incomplete. It solved the Hungarian problem, for now, but only by creating a dozen more. The emperor had become a symbol of unity, but also a symbol of imbalance. To many Slavs, he was no longer a neutral ruler, but a German emperor allied with the Magyars. The political machinery of Austria-Hungary reflected this split. The empire now had two parliaments, two governments, two economies operating in parallel. Vienna governed Cisleithania, everything west of the Lethe River. Budapest controlled Transleithania, everything east. Only foreign policy, defense, and a shared monarch linked them, but governance was not symmetrical. Hungary, in exchange for coming back under Habsburg rule, had been granted near-total autonomy, and in turn, the Hungarian elite enforced their own dominance at home, particularly over the non-Magyar populations within their borders. Magyarization became official policy. Slovaks, Romanians, Croats and Serbs in Hungary saw their languages suppressed, their schools shuttered, their identities diminished. In Vienna, Franz Joseph tried to hold a more inclusive course. His Austrian half of the empire remained more diverse and, on the surface, more tolerant. Czech and Polish elites were courted. Slovene and Ruthenian leaders found limited support. But even here, the bureaucracy was dominated by German speakers, and suspicion ran deep. The emperor had to navigate this landscape like a tightrope walker over a pit of knives. To some, he was too conservative. To others, too reformist. Nationalists accused him of betrayal. Reactionaries feared he was soft. But Franz Joseph pressed on, not with brilliance, but with endurance. He believed in the empire's mission, even when that mission became harder to define. And so he balanced. He granted favors to Slavic regions when tensions ran high, then reversed course to appease Hungarians when they protested. He reshuffled ministries, replaced governors, offered medals and symbolic gestures. It was a constant act of triage, governing not to solve problems, but to keep them from exploding. Yet underneath all of it, the core issue remained. The dual monarchy had elevated two peoples at the expense of many. It had created equality for Austrians and Hungarians, but inequality for everyone else. In Prague, Czech leaders demanded recognition. They argued that if Hungary could have autonomy, why not Bohemia? Franz Joseph listened, nodded, promised consultations. But nothing changed. Each compromise with one group risked revolt from another. The emperor's hands were tied by the very system he had built. In Croatia, frustration turned to fury. The Croats, nominally under Hungarian control, bristled at Budapest's interference. They sent petitions, then protests. When that failed, they looked south, to the Serbs, for solidarity. The seeds of South Slav nationalism were being sown, and yet, despite all this, the empire endured. Because of Franz Joseph. He became more than a man. He became an institution, stoic, remote, ageless. To millions, he was the one fixed point in a swirling storm. His constancy became a strange source of stability. Children grew up, grew old, and died knowing only one emperor. But his constancy also became inertia. Reform stalled because reform offended someone. Progress slowed because progress risked instability. Every solution created a new crisis. And so, compromise became paralysis. By the 1880s and 1890s, Austria-Hungary was modernizing on the surface, railroads, industry, universities, but stagnating at its core. Political deadlock in the Austrian parliament became routine. The Hungarian government drifted further into authoritarianism. Nationalist parties flourished. Franz Joseph aged with the century. His beard turned white. His circle of confidants shrank. He still worked from dawn to dusk, but more out of habit than hope. He no longer tried to shape history. He tried only to delay its judgment, and the cracks kept widening. In Galicia, Ukrainian peasants and Polish landlords clashed. In Bosnia, occupied in 1878, the empire had added yet another ethnic tinderbox. The South Slavs were stirring. So were the Romanians in Transylvania. And in every corner of the empire, voices whispered, "If Hungary could have autonomy, why not us?" The compromise had frozen a moment in time, but the world kept moving, and yet Franz Josef refused to abandon it. The dual monarchy was his creation, his burden, and his legacy. He believed that to reopen the deal would be to unravel the empire, and so he held the line. But even emperors cannot stop history. Franz Josef had survived the war, the revolution, and the compromise, but his empire now rested on a fault line, one stretching from Prague to Sarajevo. Nationalism was no longer a distant idea. It was everywhere, boiling beneath the surface. The Czechs, the Croats, the Serbs, the Romanians, all had watched Hungary gain power, and now they wanted their share. The emperor had tried to hold the balance. But as new voices rose in the south and east, some were no longer asking for equality, they were asking for independence. The Czechs, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and countless other nationalities looked upon this so-called union not as salvation, but as a betrayal. The empire endured, but beneath the grand parades and shimmering reforms, the cracks deepened. This episode we descend into those fractures, into the villages and provinces where national identity was no longer a cultural curiosity, but a call to arms. As the 19th century rolled on, a fire smouldered in the empire's underbelly, one that no decree from Vienna or Budapest could extinguish. This is road to destruction, the world wars. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. A newspaper article here, a folk song revived there, sermons in native tongues, quiet meetings in back rooms. But for Franz Josef and his advisors, what seemed like harmless cultural revivalism in the 1860s and 70s soon took on a more menacing tone: nationalism. It had already fractured Italy. It had shattered the German Confederation, and now it seeped into the soil of the Habsburg Empire. Czech leaders in Prague began demanding autonomy similar to Hungary's. Croatian intellectuals asked why they had to report to Budapest at all. Serbian activists whispered of a South Slav unity, and in the shadow of every grievance stood the compromise, the document that had elevated Austria and Hungary while freezing everyone else in place. Franz Josef had hoped the dual monarchy would settle the empire's problems. Instead, it had created a two-headed regime where power was jealously guarded and concession to one group risked revolt from another. To govern Austria-Hungary in this era was not to build, but to juggle. In Cisleithania, the Austrian half, Franz Josef retained more direct control. It remained a patchwork of nationalities: Germans, Czechs, Poles, Slovenes, Ukrainians, Italians. The bureaucracy functioned on paper, but national tensions clogged the machinery. The Czech lands were the most restless. Bohemia had once been the jewel of the empire. Now Czech nationalists saw themselves as the neglected third pillar, the group unjustly excluded from the compromise. They demanded equal status. Franz Josef considered a trialism proposal, a three-part monarchy. But every time he leaned toward Prague, Hungarian officials protested, and the emperor, ever cautious, stepped back. Elsewhere, Poles in Galicia were granted a degree of autonomy, hoping they might anchor loyalty in the east. But this only bred resentment among the Ukrainians, then called Ruthenians, who were treated as second-class citizens in their own homeland. In the empire of compromise, even small favors created ripple effects of jealousy and outrage. And then there was Transleithania, Hungary. And its ruling class, the Magyar elite, used it ruthlessly. Magyarization became national policy. Hungarian was imposed in schools, courts, and administration. Ethnic minorities, Romanians, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, were pushed to the margins. For Franz Josef, it was a dangerous irony. In allowing Hungarian autonomy, he had empowered a regime that now mimicked Austria's old centralizing instincts, but with even less tolerance, Nowhere was this more visible than in Croatia. Nominally under Hungarian control, Croatia had its own Sabor parliament and some rights, but in practice Budapest kept a tight grip. The Croatian language was marginalized. Education policies favored Hungarian identity. The Croats chafed and looked for ally. They found them in the Serbs. The South Slavic idea, Yugoslavism, was still in its infancy. But among intellectuals in Zagreb and Belgrade, in monasteries and coffee houses, the dream began to stir. That the South Slavs, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Bosniaks, were one people divided by empires, but destined to unite. The idea was more cultural than political, for now. But to Franz Josef's ministers, it was heresy, and to Hungarian officials, it was treason. Still, the pressure built. By the 1870s, Franz Josef found himself governing an empire of competing clocks. Each nationality moved to its own rhythm. Each demanded recognition, language rights, local control. The emperor, aging and increasingly isolated, tried to appease without yielding. Sometimes he succeeded, a symbolic nod here, a budgetary concession there. But more often, he merely delayed the inevitable. At times, the emperor showed flashes of understanding. He supported minor concessions to Slavic regions. He allowed more local representation. He resisted the worst Magyar excesses privately, but he rarely acted decisively. His caution became paralysis, and while Vienna and Budapest bickered, new forces gathered beyond the empire's borders. In the south, the Ottoman Empire, long the sick man of Europe, was crumbling. Rebellions erupted in Bosnia, Serbia, and Bulgaria. Russia intervened to protect Slavs. The Balkan question returned with a vengeance. Franz Josef watched warily. The last thing he wanted was another front of instability. But ironically, it was a diplomatic crisis that gave him new leverage. In 1878, the Congress of Berlin was convened to redraw the Balkans after the Russo-Turkish War. Led by Bismarck, the powers of Europe gathered: Germany, Russia, Britain, France, the Ottomans, and Austria-Hungary. Here, Franz Josef gained an unlikely favor. The Ottomans, eager to cut their losses, agreed that Austria-Hungary would occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina. Not annex them, just administer. It was a strategic gift, a buffer against Slavic unrest, a stepping stone into the Balkans. Franz Josef accepted. This moment, though not the focus of our episode, marked a key shift. Not just geographically, but ideologically. Austria-Hungary, an empire of compromise, was now occupying territory full of South Slavs. And while the occupation seemed peaceful on paper, in reality, it dumped gasoline on the smoldering fire. Serbs, both inside and outside the empire, saw it as a threat. Croats grew more disillusioned, and Bosniaks, caught in the middle, struggled to define their place. The South Slav question was no longer cultural. It was geopolitical, and the emperor knew it. Franz Josef was no fool. He understood that nationalism was not a passing fad. He read the reports, he received the petitions, he sensed the storm building. But what could he do? Every option had a cost. Empowering Slavs risked breaking the compromise with Hungary. Curbing Hungary risked rebellion. Reforming the system risked the entire monarchy. And so, like always, he chose endurance. He believed the empire could survive through balance, that if he remained the fixed point, the rest could circle around him. That loyalty to the emperor could transcend language, ethnicity, even resentment. In some places, it worked. There were still Croats who revered him. Some Czechs held out hope. Ruthenian bishops wrote prayers for his health. He remained a symbol, sometimes of unity, sometimes of weary stability, but symbols could only stretch so far. As the 19th century neared its close, the empire was modernizing on the surface. Railroads linked distant provinces. Factories rose. Universities trained a new generation. But politically, Austria-Hungary was falling behind. Nationalist parties flourished. Parliamentary gridlock became the norm. Croatian leaders demanded autonomy. Czech deputies walked out of the Reichsrat in protest. Serbs in Vojvodina began coordinating with Belgrade. And in the cafes and drawing rooms of Europe, observers whispered, how long could this strange, multi-ethnic empire endure? Franz Josef had no answer. But he had a warning, written on every crisis he weathered, that the empire could bend, but not forever. The time bomb ticked.
But even as these storms gathered, Austria-Hungary glittered on the surface. A gilded age was dawning, at least that's what it looked like. From the 1870s through the 1890s, the dual monarchy experienced a burst of economic energy. Railways carved paths through the Alps, connecting Vienna to Budapest, Trieste, and beyond. Ironworks belched smoke across Bohemia and Styria. New industries, textiles, chemicals, machine tools, sprang up. Banks multiplied, credit flowed, stock markets rose. Vienna became one of Europe's grandest capitals, filled with opera houses, cafes, and a thriving intellectual scene. Budapest transformed from a provincial city into a modern metropolis along the Danube. Statistics told a story of progress. Industrial output doubled, grain exports surged, population boomed, wealth grew, at least for some. Foreign observers marveled. Perhaps the Habsburgs had finally found the formula for modern greatness. But numbers can lie. Because while railroads and factories expanded, the empire's politics stagnated. Franz Josef's governance, so effective at treading water, had become an anchor. The emperor was trapped by the dual monarchy's contradictions. He could not reform without offending either Austrians or Hungarians, and he could not appease both without alienating the Slavs. The result was paralysis. In the Austrian parliament, every major nationality had its own party, its own grievances, its own demands. Sessions dissolved into shouting matches. Czechs boycotted in protest. Poles schemed for privileges. German liberals and conservatives bickered endlessly. Laws stalled. Budgets went unapproved. Newspapers mocked the Reichsrat as a circus. In Hungary, the Diet was less chaotic, but no less unjust. Hungarian elites, Magyars, dominated politics and enforced Magyarization, suppressing Slovak, Romanian and Croat culture. Elections were openly rigged. Only a tiny fraction of the population could vote. The illusion of national unity masked a reality of repression. And so, as smokestacks rose, politics sank into deadlock. Franz Josef, now in his 50s and 60s, embodied this contradiction. He still believed that the empire's future lay in modernization, but he refused to break with absolutist habits. He approved rail projects, opened universities, championed technical schools, and admired engineers. Yet he could not tolerate meaningful political change. Every time Parliament threatened to limit his power or grant real rights to minorities, he found ways to stall or dissolve it. He was not a tyrant, but neither was he a true constitutional monarch. He ruled by inertia, by ritual, by the hope that stability would outlast discontent. To many, it seemed to work. A Viennese middle class flourished, celebrating imperial stability with grand balls and electric lights. Jewish entrepreneurs and intellectuals rose to prominence, making Vienna a center of arts and sciences. The secession movement revolutionized art and architecture. Musicians like Brahms and Mahler filled concert halls. On the boulevards of Budapest, grand cafes buzzed with talk of progress. Tram lines zipped along avenues modeled after Paris. Modern sewer systems, telephone networks, and electric streetlights gave the capital a cosmopolitan glow. In Trieste, the empire's main port, shipping boomed. Steamships carried Austrian and Hungarian goods to the Mediterranean and beyond, tying the monarchy into the global economy. But these gleaming cities masked a darker reality in the countryside. The empire's glittering boulevards and roaring train stations spoke of progress, masking the political rot within. But in the cafes of Vienna and Budapest, radical pamphlets began to circulate. Ideas of socialism and anarchism that promised to sweep away the old order. In Galicia, millions of impoverished peasants lived in medieval conditions, farming tiny plots with wooden plows. In Transylvania, Romanian villages languished under Hungarian landlords. In Bosnia,
Occupied in 1878 but still outside the official empire, ethnic tensions simmered beneath an uneasy military administration. Entire regions felt left behind by the prosperity that dazzled Vienna and Budapest, and these forgotten corners bred anger and revolutionaries. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary's political elite convinced themselves that economic growth would quiet these frustrations. They believed that railways and factories would bind the empire's many nations into a single loyal body. But they underestimated how national consciousness had spread in the same years as industry. Railways moved people and ideas. Newspapers in Czech, Slovak, Serbo-Croatian, Romanian, and Ukrainian carried news of grievances and inspired dreams of independence. Economic progress, instead of healing divisions, often deepened them. Prosperous towns demanded schools in their own languages. Middle-class lawyers and merchants began agitating for more rights. Peasants, exposed to nationalist propaganda, grew resentful of distant German and Magyar rulers. Franz Josef knew this. He read intelligence reports detailing rising nationalist societies and underground groups. His police tracked student circles and clergy stirring ethnic pride, but he saw no solution. The dual monarchy's very structure, two dominant nations ruling many, left no room for real inclusion. And so he waited. He granted occasional concessions, allowed carefully controlled local autonomy, or shuffled ministers, but nothing fundamental changed. By the 1890s, the empire was a paradox. Modern in technology, archaic in politics, confident in appearances, hollow at its core. Internationally, Austria-Hungary appeared stable. Diplomats praised its central location in Europe as a guarantee of peace. Tourists flocked to its opera houses and spas. Investors poured money into its industries. But behind the scenes, alliances were shifting, and the empire's internal divisions were known to every foreign intelligence service. This sense of outward stability was bolstered by Austria-Hungary's web of alliances. After years of estrangement, Franz Josef's empire entered the League of the Three Emperors with Germany and Russia, and later solidified ties with Germany in the Dual Alliance, expanding into the Triple Alliance with Italy. These pacts gave Austria-Hungary a sense of security on the European stage, discouraging rivals, and allowing the emperor and his ministers to shift focus inward, pouring resources into railways, factories, and glittering boulevards instead of endless wars, though even its allies watched with concern. Germany saw Austria-Hungary as a crucial partner, but one increasingly paralyzed by its internal contradictions. Russia eyed the empire's Slavic populations as a source of potential allies or future conflict. Franz Josef kept to his daily routines, rising before dawn, signing documents, reading dispatches, reviewing troops. He never stopped working, but his work could no longer keep up with a changing world. The emperor's personal life reflected the same pattern, grand ceremonies masking private loneliness. His marriage with Empress Elisabeth, Sisi, was strained. His heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, grew up alienated from his father, frustrated with the empire's stagnation and attracted to radical ideas. Yet through it all, Austria-Hungary survived because it looked strong. And as long as it looked strong, many believed it was. But illusions don't last forever. Franz Josef's constancy was both the empire's anchor and its greatest weakness. But as Austria-Hungary's economic boom papered over its political cracks, new tragedies loomed in Franz Josef's own family, tragedies that would shake him to his core. Crown Prince Rudolf was born in 1858, the only son of Franz Josef and Empress Elisabeth. He was Austria's future, the bright, modern prince who many hoped would reform the empire. But from an early age, Rudolf's life was marked by conflict. From the earliest years of his life, Rudolf was kept at a distance from his father, both physically and emotionally. He spent long stretches away from the Hofburg Palace, growing up in remote imperial residences like Laxenburg Castle, or at times even more isolated estates, under the care of governesses and tutors rather than his parents. Franz Josef, devoted to duty and protocol, rarely took time to nurture or guide his son personally. This distance was not merely the result of busy schedules. It was part of a rigid court tradition that treated royal children as future instruments of statecraft, not as sons or daughters needing affection. While Rudolf's mother, Empress Elisabeth, occasionally intervened to ensure he received a modern, liberal education, Franz Josef's aloofness left a deep void. This absence of paternal warmth hardened Rudolf's sense of alienation and made him more receptive to new ideas, and increasingly resentful of the empire's stifling conservatism. While Franz Josef insisted on strict military discipline, Empress Elisabeth ensured Rudolf also received instruction from liberal tutors, who introduced him to modern science and progressive political thought. This duality created a young prince torn between the empire's traditions and the new ideas sweeping Europe. By the time he reached adolescence, Rudolf had become a young man defined as much by the chasm between himself and his father as by his own restless ambitions. His liberal ideas clashed bitterly with his father's rigid conservatism. He admired constitutionalism, science, and free thought. Franz Josef believed in divine right, military order, and Habsburg tradition. Rudolf was openly questioning absolutism and championing reforms that horrified his father and his court, setting the stage for the rift that would define his short, tragic life. Their relationship became a quiet battlefield. At dinners, they argued politics. In letters, they accused each other of ignorance. And behind closed doors, they spoke less and less. Franz Josef hoped Rudolf would grow out of what he saw as youthful rebellion. But as the prince aged, his disappointment in the empire and in his father only deepened. Rudolf's personal life mirrored his political frustrations. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium quickly soured. The match was cold and arranged. The couple drifted apart, unable to find common ground. By his late 20s, Rudolf was a restless, deeply troubled man. He drank heavily, fell into bouts of depression, and sought escape in affairs. One of those affairs was with Baroness Mary Vetsera, a 17-year-old noblewoman who became the object of Rudolf's obsessive affection. Their relationship spiraled beyond scandal. It became an all-consuming fixation. Friends warned that Rudolf's despair was growing dangerous. Court officials worried what might happen if the heir to the empire acted on his darkest thoughts. But in the vast gilded halls of the Hofburg, whispers were easy to ignore. On January 29, 1889, Rudolf and Mary traveled to his hunting lodge in Mayerling, a quiet village outside Vienna. The next morning, both were found dead. Mary had been shot. Rudolf had a fatal bullet wound to his head. The official announcement described it as a murder-suicide pact, a desperate escape from a world they believed offered them no place. But the Imperial court's response was immediate and severe. Rumors flew of a cover-up, that Rudolf had been assassinated, or that he had murdered Mary before taking his own life. The Hofburg was thrown into chaos. Ministers debated how much truth to release. Church authorities demanded a story that would allow Rudolf a Catholic burial. In the end, it was declared that Rudolf had been in a state of mental imbalance. It was enough to grant him a resting place in the Imperial crypt, but it couldn't bury the scandal. For Franz Josef, the news was a hammer blow. His only son, his heir, his hope for the empire's future, gone in an instant. The emperor was 58 years old and already weary from decades of crisis. The Mayerling tragedy seemed to confirm his deepest fear, that the Habsburg legacy was cursed. He spent days in silence, pacing the palace halls. Ministers reported that he barely ate or slept. When he did speak, it was only to ask, over and over, why? He received condolences from across Europe, but they rang hollow. Friends noted that Franz Josef aged visibly in the weeks after Mayerling. His face grew more lined, his gaze more distant. The empire noticed. Newspapers abroad speculated whether Austria-Hungary could survive with its future so uncertain. Vienna's streets filled with hushed crowds as Rudolf's funeral procession wound through the city, and in every province, from Galicia to Dalmatia, subjects whispered, if the Habsburg heir could not bear the weight of empire, who could? Rudolf's death left a chasm in the line of succession. Franz Josef had no other surviving sons. The next in line became his nephew, Archduke Karl Ludwig, an aging, uninspiring figure who showed little aptitude for leadership. And after Karl Ludwig, Succession would pass to his son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But even as Europe's great powers watched Austria's royal family with new skepticism, Franz Josef tried to carry on. He buried himself in work, reading reports late into the night and issuing decrees with mechanical precision. To many, it seemed the emperor was attempting to govern not out of hope, but out of stubborn refusal to surrender. Mayerling cast a long shadow. Within Austria-Hungary, it became a symbol of imperial decline, proof that the monarchy was crumbling not only on the outside but from within. Franz Josef's personal tragedy became the empire's political wound. Rudolf's liberal ideals had inspired many reform-minded Austrians, Hungarians and Czechs. His death was seen by them as a final blow to hopes of gradual change. Without him, conservative forces around Franz Josef reasserted themselves. The emperor himself, shaken and isolated, doubled down on caution. Parliamentary reform proposals stalled, minority grievances festered. Nationalist leaders who had once hoped for a future under a more progressive Habsburg heir began to look elsewhere, to independence, or to alliances with Austria's rivals. For years, figures in Czech, Slovak and Croatian circles had quietly placed their hopes in Rudolf's liberal sympathies, believing that patience and gradual reform could one day bring them more autonomy within the empire. His willingness to entertain federal ideas and his apparent disdain for his father's rigid conservatism offered a sliver of optimism to millions who felt excluded from the dual monarchy's narrow compromise. But with Rudolf's sudden death, that hope evaporated overnight. Many nationalists concluded that waiting for reform from within was futile and that the only way forward was to break free entirely, or to seek support from neighboring powers like Russia or Italy. Mayerling had not only shattered a family but transformed simmering discontent into a more urgent and desperate quest for change, accelerating the empire's drift toward crisis. In the months after Mayerling, Franz Josef's world grew quieter. His relationship with Empress Elisabeth, already strained, became colder still. Friends and family said he spoke less, smiled rarely, and seemed to carry the weight of a man who had lost his compass. Ministers continued to arrive each morning with papers to sign, but the emperor's eyes often seemed to look through them. He became a symbol of a dynasty out of time, a solitary, tragic figure presiding over a house that seemed destined to fall. Yet he kept going. In private moments, Franz Josef confessed to confidants that he had nothing left but duty, and so he rose each morning, dressed in his immaculate uniform, and tried to hold the center of an empire growing more restless by the day. But Franz Josef's trials were far from over. As he struggled to recover from his son's death, tragedy would strike again, this time even closer to his heart. She was born Elisabeth of Bavaria, but to Europe she became Sisi, the radiant, free-spirited empress who captured the hearts of millions. When she married the 23-year-old Franz Josef at just 16, she seemed the embodiment of youthful hope for a weary empire. But behind her beauty and grace lay a woman restless, melancholy, and forever at odds with the rigid court she had married into. From the moment she arrived in Vienna, Sisi clashed with the strict protocols of the Hofburg. She found its rituals suffocating, its courtiers hostile, and its atmosphere cold. Her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, treated her less like a partner to the emperor than a child to be managed. In these gilded cages of imperial life, Sisi's spirit grew increasingly wild and untethered. Her marriage, too, was strained. Franz Josef adored her, but he could not understand her yearning for freedom. While he spent long days at his desk or with his generals, she roamed the empire, often without him. Sisi found solace in horseback riding, travel, and long absences from Vienna. She fled to Hungary, Greece, even Egypt, anywhere she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of court life. Despite her absences, Sisi had moments of profound political importance. She was instrumental in securing the compromise of 1867 with Hungary. Her sympathy for the Magyars helped convince Franz Josef to grant them autonomy, cementing her as a beloved figure in Budapest. But this Hungarian devotion only deepened resentment from other groups who felt excluded. Yet even abroad her life was not peaceful. Sisi suffered from profound depression, which began early with the devastating loss of her first daughter Sophie, who died in infancy during a journey to Hungary in 1857. The grief lingered for years, deepening her restlessness and fueling her determination to escape the confines of court life. Decades later, The death of her only son, Rudolf, in the Mayerling tragedy of 1889, plunged her into an even darker abyss of despair, one from which she never truly emerged. After Mayerling, she began wearing black almost exclusively, refusing portraits and hiding her once celebrated beauty behind veils and parasols. Friends noted that Sisi became obsessed with the idea of death. She spoke of fate, wrote dark poetry, and confided that she expected an early, violent end. This morbid preoccupation made her the embodiment of an empire itself, drifting toward doom, elegant, haunted, and unwilling to change course. As the 1890s progressed, Sisi's health and spirit declined. She traveled constantly, always searching for places where she could remain anonymous. She was at once the most famous woman in Europe and one of its loneliest. On September 10, 1898, while in Geneva, Switzerland, she was walking along the lakeside promenade with her lady-in-waiting. An Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, radicalized by his hatred of monarchies, spotted Sisi by chance. He approached and, with a sharpened needle file hidden in his sleeve, stabbed her in the chest. At first, Sisi did not realize the severity of her injury. She stood, dazed, before collapsing. The blow had pierced her heart. She died within the hour. News of the assassination stunned Europe. Newspapers from London to Moscow mourned her death. Crowds gathered outside the Hofburg and in cities across the empire, weeping openly for the Empress they knew only through myths of beauty, sorrow, and exile. For Franz Josef, the loss was devastating beyond words. In private, he had always loved Sisi, even as they drifted apart. Now, first his son and then his wife had been torn from him by violence and fate. Friends wrote that he seemed like a man walking in a dream, hollowed out by grief. Sisi's death resonated far beyond the imperial family. It revealed the growing dangers of the late 19th century, where radical ideologies, anarchist violence, and discontent could strike even the most powerful. For Austria-Hungary's millions, the assassination felt like a dark omen, a final blow to the illusion of imperial invincibility. In Vienna, Sisi was mourned not only as a tragic empress, but as a symbol of an empire out of time. Her funeral procession drew vast, silent crowds. Yet even in death, she remained an enigma, remembered as the empress who loved Hungary more than Vienna, who fled the palace's cold corridors, and who carried a sorrow as deep as the empire's own wounds. For Franz Josef, the world grew immeasurably lonelier. Those closest to him were gone. His days became an endless routine of audiences, decrees, and ceremonies, performed more out of duty than purpose. His isolation mirrored the empire's slow drift toward a new century it was ill-prepared to face. As the 20th century dawned, Austria-Hungary appeared outwardly stable, but beneath the surface, its foundations were cracking. The old emperor carried on, determined to keep the monarchy together, even as it strained under the weight of nationalism, social unrest, and new alliances forming across Europe. But the storm clouds were gathering. The empire's future would soon rest in the hands of Franz Ferdinand, the next heir to a crumbling throne. And as they say, tragedies come in threes. First, Franz Josef lost his only son, Rudolf, in a moment of shocking despair. Then, his beloved wife Elisabeth was torn from him by an assassin's blade. And many might think the third tragedy was the bullet that would one day fell Franz Ferdinand. But as Franz Josef struggled to carry on after Sisi's assassination, his memories returned again and again to the first tragedy that had shaken his faith in his family's destiny, the death of his beloved brother, Maximilian, far across the ocean. The year was 1864. Europe's old empires still dreamed of shaping the world beyond their borders, and none more so than Napoleon III of France, who schemed to establish a friendly monarchy in Mexico. A new Mexican empire would give France a foothold in the Americas, challenge US influence and, in Napoleon's eyes, restore Europe's prestige across the Atlantic. But Napoleon needed a royal figurehead, someone with a grand title but little political power of his own. He found the perfect candidate in Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria, Franz Josef's younger brother.
Maximilian was everything Franz Josef was not: romantic, liberal-minded, a man of adventure with little patience for court protocol. He had once served as the governor of Lombardy, Venetia, but resigned in frustration after Austria's defeats in Italy. When Napoleon offered him a throne, Maximilian saw a chance to make his own mark on history, and perhaps even outshine his more reserved brother. Franz Josef was torn. He worried for Maximilian's safety and doubted the plan's wisdom. But he also saw a chance to extend Habsburg prestige and quietly rid Vienna of a restless, politically inconvenient sibling. Maximilian arrived in Mexico City in June 1864, greeted with lavish parades and grand promises. But the empire he was meant to rule was an illusion. Conservative Mexican monarchists, who had invited him, controlled little outside the capital. Republican forces loyal to President Benito Juarez held vast swaths of the countryside and enjoyed the support of much of the Mexican population. At first, Maximilian tried to win hearts and minds. He decreed social reforms, protected indigenous rights, and limited the excesses of Mexico's conservative elites. But his progressive ideals alienated his own supporters while failing to win over the Republicans. Meanwhile, the empire's real foundation, the French army, was crumbling. The United States, fresh from its civil war, began pressuring Napoleon III to withdraw his troops under the Monroe Doctrine. Facing diplomatic isolation and domestic troubles in Europe, Napoleon began pulling French forces out of Mexico in 1866. Without France's bayonets, Maximilian's empire was doomed. In Vienna, Franz Josef watched the unraveling Mexican adventure with growing dread. News arrived of ambushes, desertions, and cities falling to Juarez's forces. Each dispatch confirmed his worst fears, that his brother was trapped in a losing war thousands of miles from home. Franz Josef considered sending Austrian troops or ships, but quickly realized it would only draw Austria into a foreign quagmire it couldn't afford, especially after the devastating Austro-Prussian War in 1866. Powerless, he ordered his diplomats to negotiate Maximilian's safe passage home, but his pleas arrived too late. In May 1867, Republican troops surrounded Maximilian and his remaining loyalists in the city of Querétaro. After weeks of desperate resistance, Maximilian was betrayed by one of his own generals and captured. His fate was sealed. Despite pleas from European monarchs, including Franz Josef himself, Benito Juarez refused to pardon Maximilian. Juarez believed Mexico needed to prove that foreign-imposed rule would never succeed again. On the morning of June 19, 1867, Maximilian stood before a firing squad. He gave his executioners gold coins and asked them to aim at his heart. His last words were, "Poor Carlotta," his wife, who had already succumbed to madness after failing to win European support for his empire. The shots rang out, and with them died the last hope of a Mexican monarchy and any Habsburg claim to glory in the New World. When news reached Franz Josef, it was another hammer blow. He had lost his brother not in battle for Austria, but in a futile adventure far from home. Court chroniclers described the emperor as stricken with a grief he struggled to conceal. Ministers noted he worked in a fog for weeks, cancelling audiences and refusing to attend court functions. The empire's subjects were shocked. Rumours flew that Maximilian had been abandoned by France and by Vienna itself. For many, his execution became a symbol of the Habsburg dynasty's declining power and the dangerous illusions of 19th-century imperialism. Carlotta, Maximilian's beloved wife, never recovered her sanity. She spent the rest of her life confined to castles in Belgium, believing her husband was still alive. Maximilian's Mexican adventure exposed the gap between the Habsburgs' fading imperial ambitions and the realities of a changing world. While Europe's monarchs could still draw borders and sign treaties, they could no longer impose their will overseas with impunity. Nationalism, republicanism, and new global powers were beginning to reshape the order Franz Josef had been born into. And for the emperor himself, Maximilian's fate served as a cruel reminder. Not even royal blood guaranteed safety or success in a world growing more volatile by the year. Franz Josef had endured tragedy after tragedy, each one chipping away at his family, his hopes and his faith in his empire's future. He had buried his brother, his son, and his wife. 3 cruel blows that left him more isolated than ever. Yet even greater storms were gathering. For while tragedy hollowed out his personal world, new ambitions and old rivalries were pulling Austria deeper into the Balkans, a volatile frontier where empires collided and nationalist fires burned hotter with every passing year. And there, in the rugged hills of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the empire would seize new lands in a desperate bid to prove its strength, lands that promised glory, but were in truth a poisoned chalice that would one day bring ruin. In the decades following the Compromise of 1867, Franz Josef's empire had staggered through personal tragedy and political paralysis. But in 1878, an opportunity emerged that promised to restore Austria-Hungary's prestige, if only it didn't destroy it first. That year, the Ottoman Empire's decline sparked a crisis in the Balkans. Serbia and Montenegro had gone to war with the Ottomans. Russia intervened, defeating the Ottomans and threatening to redraw the entire region. Alarmed, the European powers convened the Congress of Berlin to prevent a wider war. The great powers of Europe gathered at the Congress of Berlin to redraw the map of the Balkans after Russia's crushing victory over the Ottoman Empire. The Balkans had become the powder keg of Europe, a chaotic, multi-ethnic frontier of collapsing Ottoman authority, rising Slavic nationalism, and endless intrigue. Austria-Hungary, weakened by its defeats but eager to reassert itself, saw a chance thanks to its powerful ally presiding over the Congress, the ever-watchful German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who styled himself an honest broker, offered a chance to project power into the Balkans, contain rising Serbian ambitions, and restore Habsburg prestige. But it was also a poisoned chalice, adding over 1 million restless Slavs to an empire already straining under ethnic tensions. The agreement that emerged gave Austria-Hungary the right to occupy and administer Bosnia-Herzegovina, 2 provinces long under Ottoman rule. But crucially, they remained officially Ottoman territory. Vienna was granted authority to govern them, build infrastructure, collect taxes, establish courts, but not to annex them outright. It was a diplomatic compromise meant to stabilize the region without provoking Russia or Serbia. Yet as history would show, it planted the seeds of future catastrophe. When Austrian troops marched into Bosnia in August 1878, they encountered fierce resistance from both Muslim and Orthodox communities. Rather than a quick show of force, the occupation turned into a brutal mountain war that claimed over 5,000 Austro-Hungarian casualties before the last strongholds surrendered. Nevertheless, Austria-Hungary established firm control. Administrators arrived to modernize the provinces, constructing railways, reorganizing towns, introducing schools, and imposing Viennese bureaucracy. To the empire's leaders, Bosnia-Herzegovina became a symbol of renewed strength, proof that the monarchy still had a future. But this victory was deeply flawed. Bosnia was occupied, not annexed, and remained legally Ottoman. This ambiguous status turned the provinces into a diplomatic powder keg. Bosnia's new administration transformed regional politics overnight. Serbia, which dreamed of uniting the South Slavs, now found Austria-Hungary standing squarely in its path. The Serbs saw Vienna's occupation as a deliberate blockade of their ambitions. Cross-border tensions flared, secret societies emerged, spies and agitators crossed the new border, radicalized by the sense that Austria was strangling the South Slav cause. Austria-Hungary's occupation of Bosnia did not just reshape local borders, it redefined the empire's relationship with its neighbors and allies. Meanwhile, Austria's relationship with Germany evolved alongside these Balkan entanglements. Under Wilhelm I and Bismarck, Berlin supported Vienna's efforts. Both empires feared Russian advances in the Balkans, but the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, convened by Bismarck to divide Africa among European powers, highlighted Austria's contrasting ambitions. While Germany and others carved up colonies overseas, Austria refused to join the African scramble. Vienna's eyes remained fixed on the Balkans, convinced its destiny lay not in faraway lands, but in the volatile heart of Europe. When Wilhelm II succeeded his grandfather in 1888, the dynamic shifted dramatically. Wilhelm's impulsive, adventurous approach to foreign policy contrasted with Bismarck's cautious realism. Franz Joseph, now the elder statesman of Europe, likely viewed the young Kaiser's bravado with concern, but also saw opportunity. Austria's alignment with Germany grew tighter, especially as Wilhelm signaled he would support more assertive policies in the Balkans. This alliance emboldened Vienna, but also deepened its entanglement with Berlin's fate. In Vienna, the occupation was hailed as a masterstroke, a revival of the Habsburg mission in the Balkans. Franz Josef's ministers celebrated the modernization of roads and railways. Newspapers praised the empire's new reach, but beneath the surface, the lack of formal annexation left Bosnia in a legal and political limbo. The region's Muslims feared expropriation. Orthodox Serbs bristled under foreign rule. Revolutionary committees in Belgrade and beyond plotted how to ignite revolt. By the 1890s, the occupation's early triumphalism gave way to grim reality. Austria-Hungary had burdened itself with a province it could neither easily control nor let go of, turning Bosnia into a pressure cooker that only grew more volatile with each year. What Franz Josef viewed as his empire's last great success was in fact a poisoned chalice. Bosnia's ambiguous status inflamed Serbia's rage, drew Russia's attention, and made Austria's every move a potential spark in a region primed for explosion. Austria's gamble in Bosnia gave the empire a foothold in the Balkans, but at a steep cost. It transformed a distant province into the heart of Europe's most dangerous fault line, and soon the empire would face an enemy determined to finish what Bosnia's occupation had started. Serbia's ambitions grew with every passing year, and with them, Austria's fear of a Balkan revolution that could unravel the entire empire. To understand why Austria-Hungary saw Serbia as its deadliest enemy, we need to look back at Serbia's long and hard-fought path to independence and how its growing nationalism would come to directly challenge the fragile peace of the region. Serbia's story begins in the early 19th century under the shadow of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Serbs had lived under Ottoman rule, enduring repression and loss of autonomy. But inspired by nationalist awakenings sweeping Europe, Serbs launched two uprisings. The first Serbian uprising in 1804 and the second in 1815, fighting to reclaim their land and identity. These revolts set Serbia on a path towards self-rule. By the mid-1800s, Serbia had won considerable autonomy, effectively governing itself while still nominally under Ottoman suzerainty. The slow but steady push for full independence culminated in the 1878 Treaty of Berlin, where the great powers recognized Serbia as a sovereign kingdom. This victory was a profound moment for Serbian nationalists, who now saw their country as a beacon for all South Slavs yearning to be free from foreign rule. But independence was only the beginning. The real ambition driving Serbia was the dream of uniting all South Slavs, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, into a single nation. This pan-Slavic vision was both political and cultural, fueled by shared language, faith and history. The Serbian narrative of Kosovo, where Serbian forces suffered a crushing defeat against the Ottomans in 1389, became a powerful symbol of sacrifice and resistance, a rallying cry for reclaiming the lost homeland. By the 1870s, Serbia was a proud semi-independent principality determined to finish the job. When the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78 erupted, Serbia sided with Russia, hoping to throw off Ottoman suzerainty entirely and expand its borders into territories populated by fellow South Slavs. Serbian armies advanced deep into Ottoman-held lands, expecting that victory would bring sweeping gains. But victory brought frustration. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the great powers gathered to redraw the Balkans after Russia's triumph. Serbia's independence was formally recognized, a huge symbolic win, but its territorial ambitions were sharply limited. Hopes of uniting Bosnia or large parts of Macedonia under a greater Serbia were dashed. Worse still, Austria-Hungary, which had not even fought in the war, was granted the right to occupy and administer Bosnia-Herzegovina, a bitter blow to Serbian dreams of expanding northward. This decision felt like a betrayal. Serbian nationalists saw Vienna's occupation of Bosnia as a theft of lands that should have been part of a future South Slav kingdom. The outcome of the Berlin Congress convinced many Serbs that the only way to realize their national goals was to challenge Austria-Hungary directly, by force if necessary. In the years that followed, nationalist secret societies in Serbia gained influence. These groups, including the precursors of the infamous Black Hand, spread propaganda, plotted assassinations, and sought to destabilize Austrian rule in Bosnia. Their networks of spies and agitators fanned out across the Balkans, radicalizing a new generation of young Serbs determined to achieve unification. Though the Serbian government did not yet openly coordinate with these radicals, officials often looked the other way, allowing secret societies to grow stronger and more brazen. Austria-Hungary watched these developments with growing alarm. The empire was a patchwork of ethnicities, and Serbian ambitions threatened to unravel this fragile mosaic. If Serbia succeeded in stirring revolts among the empire's Slavic populations, especially the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes within its borders, it could ignite a chain reaction that would tear the monarchy apart. The fear was compounded by Serbia's backing from Russia, the self-appointed protector of Slavic peoples. Russian support emboldened Belgrade and terrified Vienna, worried that a Russian-Serbian axis could isolate Austria-Hungary and destabilize the Balkans beyond repair. Meanwhile, Serbia was no longer the small, backward principality of earlier decades. The 1880s and 1890s saw Serbia modernize its military, build infrastructure, and develop industry. Its government sought alliances beyond Russia, notably turning to France for arms and diplomatic support, further alarming Austria-Hungary and Germany. When Crown Prince Rudolf died in 1889, many in Serbia believed the last chance for a more liberal, conciliatory Austria-Hungary had vanished. Without him, hopes faded that the monarchy might accommodate Slavic aspirations peacefully, pushing some Serbian leaders to see confrontation as inevitable. Border skirmishes and propaganda campaigns intensified, especially near Bosnia-Herzegovina. Serbian nationalists crossed into Austro-Hungarian territory, stirring unrest and pushing the empire's patience to the limit. Vienna responded with crackdowns and military buildups, setting a pattern of escalating tensions. By the dawn of the 20th century, Serbia had emerged as a confident and ambitious kingdom, no longer content to exist in the shadow of empires. Its leaders openly challenged Austria-Hungary's claim over South Slavic lands and dreamed of carving out a greater Serbian state from the empire's weakening grasp. Austria-Hungary, for its part, saw Serbia as an existential threat, an enemy determined to dismantle the empire from within. The rivalry between these two powers would become one of the defining conflicts of the era, shaping the fateful events that would soon plunge Europe into war. For 3 decades, Austria-Hungary had administered Bosnia-Herzegovina under the terms of the 1878 Congress of Berlin. The provinces remained officially under Ottoman sovereignty, but Vienna controlled the region in all but name, building railways, collecting taxes, and installing its officials. It was a peculiar limbo. Austria held the land, but not the legal right to claim it. To Franz Joseph, the arrangement had always felt temporary and unsatisfying. His empire had invested heavily in the province, troops, funds, bureaucracy, and yet it remained a political orphan. Bosnia was ruled, but not Austrian. Defended, but not integrated. It was a burden. And all the while, Franz Josef faced a nightmare of constant unrest. Bosnia-Herzegovina, still home to a restive mix of Muslims, Orthodox Serbs and Croats, became a breeding ground for resistance. Austrian troops were not liberators, they were occupiers. Bombings, assassinations and sabotage were a constant threat. For Franz Josef, it was grimly familiar. His beloved wife, Elisabeth, had been stabbed to death by an anarchist a decade earlier. Now political violence haunted not only his palace halls, but the very provinces he ruled. Bosnia became a cruel echo of that trauma, a place where empire, violence and grief converged. He knew Austria had one hand tied behind its back, unable to fully integrate the region, yet forced to police it at immense cost. And any attempt to crush dissent only inflamed nationalist fury further. By the early 20th century, voices in Vienna began urging a final resolution. Why continue pretending? The Ottoman Empire was crumbling, Serbia was fomenting unrest across the border, and Bosnia's ambiguous status only invited chaos. In 1908, the time finally seemed right. The Young Turk Revolution in Constantinople had overthrown Sultan Abdul Hamid II and promised to reassert Ottoman control across the empire, including, they claimed, in Bosnia. For Austria, this was unacceptable. Vienna feared that if the Ottomans tried to reclaim the province, the entire Balkan order could unravel. So in October 1908, Austria-Hungary acted. Without international approval and without warning, Franz Josef's government formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was meant to be a bureaucratic correction, a long overdue recognition of reality. But in the capitals of Europe, it was seen as something very different, a naked act of imperial aggression. Russia, in particular, exploded in fury. The Russians had backed down during the original occupation in 1878. They had swallowed Austria's presence in Bosnia, partly due to Bismarck's mediation, partly due to their own military exhaustion. But now, with a revitalized army and a new Tsar on the throne, St. Petersburg was determined to defend its influence in the Balkans and to protect its Serbian ally. To nationalists in both Russia and Serbia, Austria's annexation of Bosnia was theft, an audacious land grab that trampled the rights of Slavs and spit on international diplomacy. In Belgrade, protests erupted. Serbian newspapers called for war. The army mobilized. Secret societies like the Black Hand redoubled their efforts to stir unrest in Bosnia. To many young Serbs, the annexation confirmed what they had long believed. Austria was the great enemy of Slavic unity. In Russia, there was talk of intervention. The foreign ministry began drafting war plans, but Russia, still licking its wounds from its disastrous defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, was in no position to act. The Tsar's prestige was shattered, the navy wrecked, and domestic unrest still simmered after the 1905 revolution. While Nicholas II blustered in public, he quietly conceded in private there would be no war over Bosnia. Not now. France, his ally, had little appetite for conflict either, unwilling to be dragged into a Balkan confrontation on Russia's behalf. And Germany, Austria's steadfast ally, issued a blunt warning. If Russia fought Austria, Germany would fight Russia. Faced with the threat of a wider war they could not win, the Russians relented. In March 1909, they issued a humiliating statement recognizing Austria's annexation. Serbia, isolated and outgunned, was forced to follow suit. For Austria-Hungary, it seemed a victory. Bosnia was now legally part of the empire. Franz Josef had completed what had begun 30 years earlier. In Vienna, officials declared it a triumph of strength and resolve. But it was a brittle victory, and the empire's enemies were only emboldened. But beneath the surface, the price had been steep. Russia's humiliation would not be forgotten. Serbian hatred burned hotter than ever, and the myth of Austrian strength was paper-thin. Internally, the empire remained divided. The Hungarians resented the annexation, fearing it would upset the delicate balance of power within the dual monarchy. The Slavs of the empire, especially Croats and Slovenes, saw Bosnia's annexation as proof that Vienna would never accommodate their national aspirations. Instead of stabilizing the Balkans, Austria had poured fuel on the fire. And Franz Joseph? The aging emperor believed he had acted decisively to secure his empire's future. But in truth, he had accelerated its decline. Once again, he had underestimated the consequences of a bold move. Just as in 1866 and again in Mexico, his vision of strength had led to long-term vulnerability. The Bosnian crisis marked a turning point. It ended any illusion that Austria-Hungary could control events in the Balkans without provoking catastrophe. It deepened the divide with Russia, radicalized Serbia, and tied Austria ever more closely to Germany, and it taught Franz Joseph all the wrong lessons. He believed Russia would always back down, that Germany would always have his back, that the Balkans could be managed with decrees and bayonets. He did not see that the next crisis would come, not with negotiations, but with gunfire. He would be wrong. In the aftermath of the Bosnian crisis, Vienna hoped that Europe might return to a state of uneasy balance. But beneath the surface, the crisis had left deep scars. Serbia, forced to back down in 1909, had not forgotten. Humiliated, it poured its energies into military build-up and nationalist propaganda. The Serbian army doubled in size. Secret societies like the Black Hand expanded their networks. A generation of officers became obsessed with one goal, unifying all South Slavs under Belgrade's banner. In Russia, resentment simmered. The government publicly accepted Austria's annexation, but privately seethed. Tsar Nicholas II, still haunted by defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and the 1905 revolution, had been in no position to fight in 1909, but Russian generals vowed it would not happen again. Military reforms accelerated, and in St. Petersburg, Austria-Hungary became enemy number one. Franz Joseph, meanwhile, clung to his old habits. He believed the storm had passed, but he was increasingly out of step with the times. His foreign minister, Ehrenthal, who had masterminded the annexation, died in 1912. In his place came the cautious and indecisive Count Berchtold. At the very moment the Balkans demanded agility and decisiveness, Austria drifted. In October 1912, the storm broke. 4 Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece and Bulgaria, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. They formed the Balkan League, an improbable alliance united by a common goal to drive the Turks out of Europe for good. The war moved quickly. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened by years of internal strife and military decline, collapsed in the face of the League's onslaught. Within weeks, Serbian and Bulgarian troops surged into Macedonia. Montenegro attacked in the west. Greek forces seized Thessaloniki. Albanian lands were overrun. To the world, it seemed a stunning victory for the Balkan states. To Austria-Hungary, it was a nightmare come true. The Ottoman army, reformed and equipped with German assistance, had collapsed. It was a warning. Not even German influence could hold back the Balkan storm forever. Franz Joseph watched in dismay as the Balkans were redrawn without him. Serbia emerged as the big winner, doubling its territory and population. For the first time, Serbia now shared a border with Austria's Albanian lands and Montenegro. Worse still, Serbian troops now occupied northern Albania and dreamed of taking a port on the Adriatic Sea. Vienna was horrified. A Serbia with a coastline would be unthinkable, a direct threat to Austria's influence in the Adriatic. The empire had spent decades trying to contain Serbia, and now the little kingdom seemed poised to dominate the region. The mood in Vienna darkened. Military leaders demanded mobilization. Some in the general staff urged preemptive war. But Franz Josef, now 82 years old, hesitated. Memories of 1866 and the Austro-Prussian War haunted him. He feared German abandonment, Hungarian obstruction, and a repeat of past disasters. Diplomacy prevailed. In December 1912, Austria issued a stern ultimatum to Serbia: withdraw from Albania or face consequences. Serbia reluctantly complied, but its pride was wounded further. Once again, Austria had blocked its ambitions. The crisis ended with Albania declared an independent state under international protection. But Austria's supposed victory only masked its growing impotence. The empire had no role in the Balkan League, no allies in the region, no real influence, and Franz Josef knew it. Austria had barely exhaled when a second war erupted. This time the Balkan states turned on each other. Bulgaria, dissatisfied with its share of Macedonia, attacked its former allies Serbia and Greece. Romania and the Ottoman Empire joined in against Bulgaria. Within weeks, Bulgaria was crushed. Serbia again emerged victorious. Its army, now battle-hardened, gained even more territory, and more dangerously, it grew more confident. Austria-Hungary, still reeling from its non-role in the First War, once again watched from the sidelines. Franz Josef expressed outrage in private, but his options were limited. Hungarian politicians blocked military action. Germany counseled restraint. The empire, already strained by internal nationalist tensions, feared what a Balkan war might trigger at home. By the summer of 1913, Serbia stood stronger than ever. It had become a regional power. Its population had swelled. Its army was now tested and respected, and in Belgrade, the belief hardened that the next step must be the liberation of Slavs still under Austrian rule, especially in Bosnia. To Franz Josef, the Balkan Wars were a slow-motion disaster. He had ruled for over 6 decades. He had seen Hungary rebel, Austria defeated, and watched as anarchists, bandits and nationalists struck at the heart of his empire, and even his own family. Now, in his twilight years, he watched the empire lose its grip on the region that had once defined its power. Internally, things were no better. The Hungarians grew more assertive, resisting military reform. Slavs within the empire demanded equality. Croats and Slovenes agitated for rights. Czechs pushed for federalism. Franz Josef, rigid and old-fashioned, had no answer. His empire was not evolving, it was stagnating. And looming over it all was the issue of succession. The emperor's heir, Franz Ferdinand, was a divisive figure. He had ideas, dangerous ones according to some. He spoke of reforming the empire into a federation. He sympathized with the Slavs. He despised the Hungarians. He had made enemies in every court of Europe, and yet he might have been the last chance to save Austria-Hungary. By late 1913, Austria-Hungary had managed to avoid war. But the cost had been relevance. The Balkan League had shattered the old balance of power. The Ottomans were nearly gone from Europe. Serbia was ascendant, and Austria had been a bystander, watching from the sidelines as its German ally tightened its grip on the collapsing Ottoman Empire, laying tracks not just through Anatolia, but through the future of the region itself. In Vienna, the military pushed harder than ever for action. Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf repeatedly called for preventive war against Serbia. He wrote Franz Josef hundreds of memoranda, warning that time was running out, that Austria must act or perish. But the emperor resisted. War was not so easily controlled, not in the Balkans. Instead, Austria settled for military preparedness and intelligence gathering. The empire increased its garrisons along the Serbian border. It funded loyalist movements in Bosnia. It tracked the activities of Serbian agents. Everyone knew the situation was unsustainable. No one knew what would spark the next crisis. In June 1914, Franz Ferdinand planned a trip to Sarajevo. It was meant to be a routine inspection, but to many Serbs and Bosnian nationalists, he was a symbol of everything wrong with Austria. The Balkans once again were ready to explode. The Balkan Wars showed the limits of Austria-Hungary's power. The empire had survived, yes, but it had lost the initiative, lost the narrative, lost the fear it once inspired. Serbia had grown stronger, Russia more determined, and Austria, it had watched and waited and hesitated into irrelevance. But history would not wait for Franz Josef. Born in 1863, Franz Ferdinand was not supposed to be heir to the throne. He was the nephew of Emperor Franz Josef, not his son. But when Crown Prince Rudolf died in the tragic Mayerling incident of 1889, and Franz Josef's younger brother Karl Ludwig passed shortly after, the line of succession shifted. Suddenly, Franz Ferdinand was next. He was 26, stubborn, serious, and deeply devout. Unlike many in the imperial court, he didn't gamble, didn't carouse, and wasn't prone to flattery. He had a biting wit, a heavy temper, and a fierce sense of duty. Many found him abrasive, some found him dangerous, but no one could deny he was different. Franz Ferdinand's political beliefs defied easy labels. To conservatives, he was unpredictable. To liberals, he was authoritarian. In truth, he was both a reformer and a reactionary, often at the same time. He loathed Hungarian dominance within the dual monarchy. He believed the 1867 compromise had given Budapest too much power and that the Hungarians oppressed the Slavic peoples of the empire. His answer? Reform the empire, but not into a democracy. Rather, he imagined a federation of autonomous Slavic states under the Habsburg crown. This vision, sometimes called trialism, would add a third pillar to the empire alongside Austria and Hungary. To Croats, Czechs and Slovenes, this was an enticing dream. To Hungarians, it was a threat to their power. To Germans and Austrians, it risked weakening their dominance. And to Serbs, who hoped to unify all South Slavs under their leadership, it was sabotage. Franz Ferdinand's federation would co-opt the Slavs inside Austria-Hungary and make Serbian pan-Slavism irrelevant. It's no wonder nationalist groups like the Black Hand viewed him as a dangerous obstacle. For all his political ambitions, Franz Ferdinand was a deeply private man. His great love, and enduring scandal, was his wife, Sophie Chotek. She was noble, but not of royal blood. Their marriage was considered morganatic, meaning she could never be empress, and their children would never inherit the throne. His determination to marry for love and endure the humiliation it brought revealed a softer, more stubborn side. In an empire built on hierarchy and tradition, Franz Ferdinand was willing to break the rules. He made enemies by doing so, but he also showed a kind of loyalty and resolve rarely seen in the Habsburg family. Despite his conservative appearance, Franz Ferdinand understood that the empire's military needed modernization. He toured army bases relentlessly. He forged close ties with Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, who shared his hawkish views. Though the two men often clashed, Konrad was impulsive, Franz Ferdinand more cautious. Both agreed on one thing: Austria-Hungary could not afford to appear weak. Franz Ferdinand supported increasing the size and professionalism of the military, but unlike Konrad, he opposed war with Serbia, not because he sympathized with them, but because he feared it would spark a wider European conflict. In his view, internal reform was the path to strength. War was a dangerous gamble. By the 1910s, Franz Ferdinand was a man with immense power, but no real allies. He had the emperor's formal blessing, but little warmth from the old man who had ruled for 6 decades and never truly embraced him. And yet, despite the emotional distance between them, whatever his faults, Franz Josef saw his nephew Franz Ferdinand as indispensable. The Habsburg line had narrowed through loss after loss. A brother executed, a son dead by suicide, another brother taken by illness. Now only Ferdinand remained. Franz Ferdinand distrusted the Hungarian elite, disliked the liberal aristocracy in Vienna, and barely tolerated Germany's growing dominance in Austria's foreign policy. Wilhelm II, in particular, rubbed him the wrong way. Franz Ferdinand saw the German Kaiser as vain, reckless, and domineering. He feared that Germany would drag Austria into a war it couldn't win. Yet he also knew the empire couldn't survive without German support. This contradiction, admiration and resentment, would define Austria's pre-war diplomacy. By 1914, Franz Ferdinand's influence was rising. Though Franz Josef was still emperor, many assumed it would not be for long. So when Franz Ferdinand planned a visit to Bosnia in June,
It was more than a routine military inspection. It was a political signal, a way to assert authority over the empire's most volatile province. He and Sophie would travel to Sarajevo on June 28th, a date loaded with symbolic weight. It was the anniversary of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, a defining moment in Serbian collective memory. To many Serbs, it marked not just a military defeat, but the beginning of centuries of oppression, and the birth of a national soul forged in suffering. For nationalist groups in Serbia and Bosnia, this was no routine visit. It was a provocation, a symbol of imperial arrogance trampling on sacred ground. The fact that the imperial court chose this day for a military inspection in the heart of Slavic resentment was more than tone deaf. It reflected the very blindness that would soon shape Vienna's disastrous diplomacy with Serbia, Russia, and the wider world. Franz Ferdinand was no democrat. He had no interest in parliamentarism or universal suffrage, but he saw the empire's crisis clearly and wanted to fix it from the top down. In a different time, with different support, he might have succeeded. His federal vision could have given the Slavs a voice. His military reforms might have staved off decline. His caution might have slowed the rush to war. But it was not to be. He had too few allies, too many enemies, and he would never get the chance to rule. Franz Ferdinand was many things: a cold aristocrat, a loyal husband, a religious traditionalist, a reluctant reformer. To some, he was the empire's last hope. To others, its last obstacle. His assassination in Sarajevo would not just remove a man, it would remove an idea, a path not taken. And in doing so, it would seal the fate of an empire. Franz Ferdinand's decision to visit Sarajevo in June 1914 came at a precarious time. Bosnia-Herzegovina, formally annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, remained deeply unstable. The province simmered with nationalist anger, Serbian-backed groups stirred unrest, and the empire's intelligence services knew it. The military visit was planned as a show of authority, an attempt to demonstrate imperial strength in a volatile borderland, but the timing could not have been worse. The date chosen, June 28, was no ordinary day. It marked the 525th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, a defining moment in Serbian history. In 1389, Serbian forces had fallen to the Ottomans in a brutal clash that became mythologized as the birth of Serbian martyrdom. For many Serbs, this was a sacred day of remembrance, a symbol of suffering and sacrifice against an imperial overlord and eventual rebirth. To schedule an imperial military inspection in Sarajevo on that very day, with Austrian troops marching through the streets, was more than tone-deaf. It was incendiary. To Serb nationalists, it felt like an act of deliberate provocation. In truth, it was likely ignorance, a failure by the imperial court to grasp the depth of nationalist sentiment. But that very ignorance would soon shape Austria's catastrophic handling of Serbia, Russia, and the July crisis. Behind the scenes, conspirators were already at work. The Black Hand, a secret nationalist society tied to elements of the Serbian army, had long plotted violence against the Habsburgs. In early 1914, they learned of Franz Ferdinand's planned visit to Sarajevo. A team of young Bosnian Serbs was assembled for the mission. Most were in their teens or early 20s. They believed they were sacrificing themselves for the Slavic cause. The weapons, pistols, bombs, and cyanide capsules were smuggled in from Serbia with the assistance of military intelligence officers. The men were trained and armed in secret, then sent across the border. Sarajevo's local authorities were either unaware or willfully blind. Security for the visit was poorly coordinated. The route had been published in newspapers. The motorcade would travel along the Appelquis, a narrow road beside the Miljacka River, before arriving at the town hall. The morning of June 28 began with a failed attempt. As the motorcade passed the first group of conspirators, one threw a bomb at Franz Ferdinand's car. It bounced off the folded-down convertible roof and exploded under the next vehicle, injuring members of the entourage and bystanders. The attacker was caught. The motorcade sped away. Franz Ferdinand, visibly shaken, continued to the town hall. There he delivered a brief and icy speech.
"Mr. Mayor, I come here on a visit and I get bombs thrown at me. It is outrageous." Afterwards, the Archduke decided to visit the wounded in hospital, but the route had not been properly communicated to the drivers. As the cars turned off the main road by mistake, they slowed to a crawl, right in front of a small delicatessen. Standing there was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, one of the failed conspirators from earlier that morning. By sheer chance, he found himself in the exact right place at the exact right time. But what was right for him was disaster for the world. A wrong turn, a stalled car, a series of improbable missteps, and suddenly the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was just meters away from a trained assassin, exposed, unmoving, and unaware. And this time, he wouldn't fail. At 10:45 a.m., Princip stepped forward, raised the pistol. 2 shots rang out, and in that instant, the world changed forever. At first, no one was sure what had happened. The shot had echoed off the stone walls of Franz Josef Street. The crowd froze. The car rolled forward a few feet. Then came the screams. Franz Ferdinand slumped to his left. Sophie collapsed beside him. She whispered, "For God's sake, what has happened to you?" He could only reply, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Moments later, she was dead. Franz Ferdinand followed within minutes. Blood poured from his mouth as he lost consciousness in the arms of Count Harrach. The doctor was called far too late. There was nothing to be done. The motorcade rushed to the governor's residence. Chaos reigned. Telephone lines jammed. Telegrams flew in every direction. Eyewitness accounts conflicted. Some claimed a lone gunman. Others insisted it was a Serbian conspiracy. A few even blamed local Bosnian Muslims. The Black Hand's plan had partially failed. Most of the conspirators had not carried out their attacks, but Gavrilo Princip had succeeded, by chance more than coordination. He was subdued by the crowd and arrested. He had tried to shoot himself but was stopped. His cyanide capsule failed. Other conspirators attempted to flee. Some were caught within hours. Others made it as far as the Serbian border before being apprehended. Within 24 hours, most were in custody. The Austro-Hungarian authorities moved quickly, but not quietly. Sarajevo was placed under martial law. Mass arrests followed. And in the background, a desperate question. Had Serbia itself been involved? Dozens of suspects were arrested, many on flimsy evidence. Torture was common. The Black Hand's plot, once murky, quickly unraveled under interrogation. Franz Josef was at his summer retreat in Bardischl when the telegram arrived, but it was delayed, softened, distorted. Franz Josef was informed gently, in fragments. He was told first of the attack, and then, minutes later, that both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were dead. The Emperor, now 83, received the news in silence. No tears, no visible anger, just a long, still pause. When his valet approached him the next morning, Franz Josef reportedly whispered, "A higher power has re-established the order. I could not." It was a cruel sentiment, perhaps an honest one, or maybe it was just an emperor that had seen so much tragedy, trying to keep his composure and any sort of control he still had left. In private, the loss hit deeper. Franz Josef had never liked Franz Ferdinand. He disliked his politics, his independence, and most of all, his marriage. But Ferdinand was still family. More importantly, he was the only heir left. In the span of 4 decades, Franz Josef had buried 3 heirs and was now told he would have to bury a 4th. The line of succession had collapsed around him. The Habsburgs had ruled in strength for over 600 years, a house that ruled multiple empires across Europe, and now, under Franz Josef, were thinning into non-existence, not from revolution, but from grief, isolation, and fate. This couldn't continue. In Sarajevo, grief turned to fury. Within hours, mobs filled the streets. Ethnic Serbs were attacked. Serbian-owned businesses were looted and burned. Serbian Orthodox churches were burned. The violence was spontaneous at first, then encouraged by police and officials. The authorities, far from stopping the violence, encouraged it. Local officials provided fuel for the mobs. The message was clear: Serbia would pay. The state cracked down, not on the rioters, but on the Serbs. Thousands were arrested, hundreds were beaten, some were executed without trial. The empire had found its scapegoat, and the public, reeling from shock, wanted revenge and blood. In the days that followed, similar riots broke out in other cities across the empire. Zagreb, Mostar, even parts of Vienna. The anger was real, but it was also useful, a tool to shape the narrative. Austria was the victim, Serbia the aggressor. News of the assassination did not bring mourning in all corners of the empire, though. In parts of Bosnia and Serbia, the mood was jubilant. Bells rang in Orthodox churches. Crowds in Belgrade reportedly cheered in the streets. To many Serbs and South Slavs, Franz Ferdinand had been no peacemaker. He was a symbol of imperial domination, of foreign rule over Slavic lands. His death felt like a blow struck for freedom. That celebration, whether spontaneous or encouraged by local authorities, would only inflame Vienna's rage. In the minds of many Austrians and Franz Josef, these celebrations at the killing of the heir of the empire only solidified the narrative that this was backed by the government. The bodies of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were returned to Vienna. But there was no great imperial procession, no grand funeral in the capital. Sophie, as a morganatic wife, had no official status. Protocol dictated she could not lie in state beside her husband. So the ceremony was quiet, almost private. The two were buried together at Artstetten Castle, far from the grandeur of the Habsburg crypt in Vienna. The funeral symbolized what the court had long felt. Franz Ferdinand never truly belonged, but his death, and Sophie's, had changed everything. Behind closed doors, more dangerous conversations began. At the Ballhausplatz, Austria's foreign ministry, Count Berchtold debated what to do next. Should they send a protest, demand arrests, declare war? In the days that followed, ministers and military leaders met in hushed tones. Intelligence from Bosnia suggested Serbian involvement. The army began reviewing its options. Konrad von Hotzendorf, chief of staff, needed no convincing. He had been urging a strike against Serbia for years. Now he wrote, "We must settle accounts with Serbia. The sooner, the better." But even now, the empire hesitated. The grief was real, but the politics were delicate. Hungary might object, Russia might intervene. Germany's support would be essential. That question, what will Germany do, would dominate the coming days. A foreshadowing of the lethargic and slow bureaucracy that would only become more prevalent and disastrous in the following week. The deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were more than a tragedy. They were a rupture, an event so emotionally charged, so politically dangerous, that it shattered what little remained of Europe's fragile peace. The empire mourned in silence. Some crowds rioted in rage. In Slavic towns and villages, others paraded and rejoiced. And in the ministries of Vienna, some generals and statesmen began to plan their revenge, and others that could see the death to come tried to stop the momentum. But with 30 years of tick-for-tack violence and assassinations, revenge would win out, and revenge in the age of alliances would not come cheap. In the hours and days after the assassination, Vienna should have moved quickly. The empire had its casus belli. The streets demanded vengeance, the generals were ready, but Austria-Hungary was not. The machinery of the state was rusted, the military scattered, the ministries paralyzed by indecision. Count Berchtold, the foreign minister, lacked initiative. Franz Josef, now 83, moved slowly, perhaps out of grief, perhaps because that was all he knew. Even Konrad von Hotzendorf, the hawkish chief of staff who had spent years demanding war, hesitated. Not because he doubted the need, but because the army wasn't ready. The harvest was coming. Soldiers were in the fields. Mobilization would take weeks. And then there was Hungary. The empire was dual, and dual paralysis followed. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza opposed war. He feared Russian retaliation, domestic upheaval, and the fury of Slavs within the empire. He demanded assurances. that Austria would not seize Serbian territory, that any move would be carefully measured. So Austria did nothing for days, and Hungary watched nervously. It was Hungarian territory, not Austrian, that bordered Serbia and Russia. If war came, it would be Hungarian soil that burned first. Prime Minister Tisza feared not only Russian intervention, but ethnic chaos. Millions of Slavs lived within Hungary's borders, Serbs, Croats, Ruthenes, and many had little loyalty to Vienna. A war with Serbia, Tisza warned, could become a war inside the empire itself. Rage festered, the streets quieted, the moment slipped. Unless Vienna acted soon, Serbia would recover, Russia would mobilize, and the chance to strike would be lost. Austria needed a signal from Berlin. Since the 1879 alliance, Austria-Hungary had depended on Germany for security. It was the keystone of Habsburg foreign policy. Without German backing, Austria was exposed to Russia, to Italy and France, even to its own restive peoples. In early July 1914, Count Hoyos, a senior diplomat, boarded a train to Berlin. In his briefcase was a letter from Franz Joseph to Kaiser Wilhelm II expressing grief and seeking guidance. Alongside it was a more direct message from Berchtold to Germany's leadership. Austria wanted war. On July 5th, Hoyos arrived. He met with German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, then with the Kaiser himself. Austria's intentions were clear. It would move against Serbia. What Berlin needed to decide, and quickly, was whether to support it. Germany faced a dangerous choice: support Austria and risk war with Russia and most likely France. Hold Austria back and risk losing its only true ally in Europe. The Kaiser was outraged by the assassination for a fellow monarch and also a friend. He called it a monstrous crime. He believed Austria's patience had run out. And more than anything, he feared German encirclement, a war on two fronts. Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg and military leaders like Moltke agreed. They believed a European war was likely, perhaps inevitable. So better now, they argued, while Germany was strong, than later, when Russia's military reforms were complete and they had the weight of the European society behind them. And so, on July 5th, the message was sent. Germany would support Austria-Hungary unconditionally, no matter what Austria decided, even if it meant war with Russia, even if it meant war with France. There were caveats, half-hearted suggestions for diplomacy, but the core of the message was unmistakable. It was a blank check, and Austria wasted no time cashing it. With German backing secured, Vienna's tone changed. Berchtold grew bolder. Conrad began planning. Even Tisza was brought into line, promised that war would be limited, that Serbia would be punished but not partitioned. The ultimatum was drafted in secret. It would be delayed, deliberately, until the French president returned home from a diplomatic visit to Russia. That way, France and Russia would not coordinate their response. It was a calculated delay. French President Raymond Poincaré and his Minister of War had just visited Tsar Nicholas II in St. Petersburg, reaffirming Franco-Russian unity. But by July 23rd, the French delegation would be aboard a ship returning across the Baltic. Vienna and Berlin knew this. They timed the delivery of the ultimatum to coincide with that voyage, ensuring that when the crisis broke, France and Russia would be unable to coordinate a response. The goal was simple: isolate Serbia, divide the Entente, strike before the alliances could solidify. Overall, the thing Berlin urged the most was speed. The longer Austria delayed, the more likely it was that Europe's mood would shift from shock to sympathy. In London, Paris, and even St. Petersburg, there was a brief window where the assassination had created a sense of moral clarity. Austria was the victim, Serbia the instigator. But that window was closing fast. Berlin pressed Vienna to move before cooler heads in Europe could rally behind Serbia. The ultimatum, they argued, needed to come suddenly, forcefully, before the diplomats had time to react. Austria's war plan was moving, slowly, methodically, but now, irreversibly. None of this was inevitable. Cooler heads could have prevailed. But with German support, Austria no longer felt the need to be cautious. Berlin believed its backing would localize the conflict, that Russia might back down, that France might hesitate, that Britain might stay out. They were wrong about all of it. The road to war was now paved with rage and calculation, with emotion more so than strategy. Germany had not pulled the trigger, but it had loaded the gun and handed it to an empire that still didn't know how to aim.
The mood in Vienna shifted. Suddenly the old empire found its voice. Berchtold grew bold. Conrad drew up war plans. Even Istvan Tisza, once the most cautious man in government, fell in line. But for all its newfound confidence, Austria-Hungary still moved with glacial slowness. Weeks passed. The moment slipped. It wasn't until July 23rd, 25 days after the assassination, that Austria made its move. Not with an invasion or a declaration, but with paper and pen. A letter. 10 demands, 48 hours, no extensions. It was an ultimatum crafted to be rejected, and Serbia, against all odds, tried not to. This is road to destruction, the world wars. Austria-Hungary had the support of Germany, the backing of its generals, and the rage of a grieving empire. But beneath the surface, it was still divided. Old, exhausted. The ministers squabbled, Franz Joseph remained aloof, and while they spoke of war, they took few precautions to prepare for it. Even Conrad, who had spent years urging war with Serbia, warned of delay. The army wasn't ready. The harvest was about to begin. Troops were scattered. Railways were full. Mobilization would take weeks. Worse, Austria hadn't even reinforced its frontier with Russia, despite knowing that any move against Serbia could provoke Russian retaliation. What Vienna needed was time, but what Berlin demanded was speed, and so the empire tried to have it both ways. The foreign ministry drafted the ultimatum in secret, shielding it from even their Italian allies. It was deliberately delayed, not out of caution, but calculation. France's president and top ministers were on a visit to Russia. If Austria struck before they returned, Serbia might be isolated. When the ultimatum was finally delivered at 6 p.m. on July 23rd, the timing was no accident. It was a diplomatic ambush. 10 demands, severe, humiliating, and backed by the threat of war. The ultimatum demanded that Serbia suppress all anti-Austrian publications, dissolve nationalist groups like Narodna Odbrana, purge its military of hostile officers, arrest specific conspirators and cooperate fully in punishing those linked to the assassination. But the most explosive demand, number 6, required Austrian police and officials to operate inside Serbia. It was a direct assault on sovereignty. Not even a defeated state would accept such terms, and Serbia feared what they might uncover. It was the poison pill. No state could accept it and remain sovereign. But that was the point. Austria didn't want the ultimatum accepted. It wanted justice and revenge, and to go to war while appearing to have sought peace. The reaction in Europe was swift. The grief had faded. Sympathy for Austria was slipping. Winston Churchill called the ultimatum the most insolent document of its kind ever devised. Even Germany was surprised by its harshness. In Belgrade, Serbia's leaders were stunned. President Nikola Pasic was away campaigning when it arrived. When he returned, he had barely 36 hours left to respond. There was no time to consult Russia, no time to deliberate. In a remarkable reply, Serbia accepted nearly every Austrian demand. It shut down nationalist groups. It pledged to arrest conspirators. It even offered to investigate its own officials. But on the question of foreign investigators operating inside Serbia, they proposed that the issue be referred to The Hague or submitted to international arbitration. It was not defiance. It was a plea for dignity, not rejection, but not full acceptance. The reply was one of the most conciliatory in modern diplomatic history. To most of Europe, Serbia had met Austria more than halfway. In London and Paris, the response was hailed as a clear attempt to avoid war. Even Kaiser Wilhelm thought it was enough. But Austria had already made its decision. Berchtold declared the reply insufficient. Vienna severed diplomatic ties. Diplomats and ambassadors were recalled. Mobilization began. The machinery of war, long rusted, long ignored, began to creep to life. What began as an act of theatre had become policy. Austria had convinced itself it could contain the fire it was about to start. It believed it could punish Serbia, silence its enemies, and restore order to its crumbling empire. Austria still clung to the illusion of control. Franz Josef remained detached, silent. Berchtold appeared almost relieved. The ministers, having spent a month convincing themselves that Russia wouldn't act, now hoped their delay had paid off. But in reality, Austria was striking a match next to a powder keg. It had crafted an ultimatum so harsh it could not be accepted, and when Serbia tried, against all odds, to comply, it was ignored. In doing so, Austria not only rejected diplomacy, it rejected its final chance to avoid catastrophe. The tired and brittle Franz Josef and the empire he ruled believed this was a final stand to assert authority. In truth, it was signing its own death warrant, and it had done so with a pen. There would be no turning back.
For decades, Franz Josef had lived with the dread of a Balkan crisis that would draw in Russia. He feared a war the empire could not win, one that would stretch across its borders and expose Austria's fragility. Serbia was a threat, yes, but Russia was the abyss. That fear had nearly come to life in 1908 when Austria annexed Bosnia. Russia protested but backed down. At the time, it was still reeling from a humiliating defeat by Japan and a near revolution at home. Its army was disorganized, its pride wounded, its leadership cautious. But in the years that followed, that humiliation festered. Russia poured money into military reform, expanded its rail network, strengthened its ties with France, and made one thing clear to both allies and enemies. The next time Austria challenged the Slavs, Russia would not stay silent. So when Austria moved against Serbia in July 1914, the Tsar and his ministers faced a familiar question, but with a very different answer. They could not afford to back down again. Inside the Russian court, opinions were divided. Some ministers, like Foreign Minister Sazonov, believed that war was not only possible but likely, and that it would be better to confront Austria now with honor than retreat again and lose credibility in the Balkans with its allies and across Europe. Others urged caution, knowing how fragile the Russian state still was, and some quietly simply wanted a fight. Tsar Nicholas II was deeply torn. He did not want war. He feared it would tear Russia apart, as it nearly had a decade earlier. But he also feared what it would mean if Russia allowed Serbia to be destroyed. That would be a humiliation not just for Serbia, but for Russia's identity, as the guardian of the Slavs and as a great power. The pressure wasn't just emotional. Russian generals warned that a failure to act would shake alliances, especially with France. The entire balance of power in Europe, they argued, was on the line. And so, reluctantly, Nicholas gave the order. On July 28th, Austria declared war on Serbia, and on July 29th, Russia began partial mobilization, not just along its border with Austria, but toward Germany as well. For Franz Josef, this was the nightmare realized. A limited war was already becoming a continental one. Austria had assumed Russia would hesitate, that its army wasn't ready, that internal divisions would delay any serious response. But they were wrong, and catastrophically so. Worse still, Austro-Hungary itself was unprepared. The empire had spent weeks crafting a diplomatic trap, but had made almost no preparations for the consequences. Its military focus was entirely on Serbia. No troops had been moved east. No plans had been made for a two-front war. And now, with the very crisis it had long feared unfolding, Austria stood exposed. The assumption that this war would be short, limited and winnable was delusional from the start, and the same pressures that had driven Austria to act now compelled Russia to respond. At first, Russia's mobilization was framed as limited, a warning, not a declaration, but its meaning was unmistakable. It was a signal that Serbia would not be allowed to fall without resistance, that Slavic blood would be answered with Slavic steel, and that Austria's actions would have consequences far beyond the Balkans. In Berlin, German leaders had hoped that their blank check would buy a quick and isolated war, if only Austria acted quickly while Europe's sympathies were still on its side. But now Russia's move was seen as provocation. Partial mobilization was treated not as a warning, but as a first step toward a much larger war. And if war was coming, Germany would strike first. What Russia intended as deterrence, Germany interpreted as escalation. And the fuse burned lower. Austria had believed it could punish Serbia without waking the powers around it, and perhaps, if it had moved faster, it could have. But in turning a regional tragedy into a political opportunity, Austria had triggered the very disaster it had long claimed to fear. Its government, confident and divided in equal measure, had opened the door to a broader conflict, one it neither desired nor understood. Franz Joseph, now a ruler in name more than force, watched as his empire edged toward a war that would define and destroy the world he had spent a lifetime trying to preserve. Franz Joseph had acted. Russia had responded. And now history was beginning to slip beyond anyone's control. Franz Joseph had outlived revolutions, assassinations, and a century of European upheaval. He had buried his wife, his son, 2 brothers, and now, perhaps, the last viable heir to an empire that had lasted over 600 years. And yet, in the twilight of his reign, he still clung to the old certainties. That alliances would hold, that Serbia could be punished, that Russia might hesitate. But the world had changed. As Austria moved toward war, Franz Joseph watched not as a strategist, but as a figurehead, weary, isolated, and surrounded by men who promised strength but delivered chaos. The empire that bore his name was slipping from his grasp. Its armies were unready, its borders were exposed, and the war he had tried to keep distant was now drawing closer with every hour.
The war Austria wanted was never meant to be grand or global. It was supposed to be brief, punitive, a final blow against a defiant neighbor, and a message to the restless peoples inside the empire's own borders. But the world didn't cooperate. The ultimatum to Serbia had been Austria's first move. War followed days later, but the rest, Russia, Germany, France, Britain, was never part of the plan. Vienna believed the world would blink. It didn't, because Austria's crisis was never just Austria's, not anymore. Russia's mobilization came first, partial at first, then full. It was a move Austria had hoped to avoid, and one it had made almost no preparations for. The eastern frontier was undefended. There was no war plan ready for Russia, only Serbia, and now the empire faced both. In Berlin, the German High Command saw Russia's mobilization not as a warning but a countdown. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, its strategy for fighting a 2-front war, required a rapid strike west before Russia could gather strength in the east. So when Russia moved, Germany followed. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. And on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany after its armies violated Belgian neutrality. The dominoes had fallen, and the fuse Austria lit in Sarajevo had reached the powder. The war was now continental. Austria, the empire that had spent a month hesitating, had become a participant in the greatest conflagration Europe had ever seen. But for Franz Joseph, this wasn't a misstep. It was destiny, and in his eyes, the only way to halt the slow death of a 600-year-old Habsburg empire. He had ruled for 66 years, longer than any other monarch in Europe, longer than any living Austrian had known peace without him. He had endured revolution, lost his brother in Mexico, his wife to an assassin, his son to suicide, and his heir to a bullet in Sarajevo. He had led his empire through defeats at Solferino and Königgrätz, through humiliation in Italy and Germany, through the slow fracture of compromise with Hungary and the rising nationalism of Slavs, Croats, Czechs and Serbs, and through it all, he endured. The empire no longer resembled the one he inherited. It was smaller, weaker, more divided, but it still existed, and in Franz Josef's eyes that alone was proof of its worth. So when the final crisis came, when the last heir fell, when the last insult landed, Franz Josef did not flinch. He struck back, not out of bloodlust, not even out of vengeance, but because he believed it was his duty, to the dynasty, to the empire, and perhaps to give meaning to everything that had come before. He did not doubt. He did not apologize. He believed in the necessity of the strike. Franz Josef was not swept along by war. He gave himself to it, quietly, resolutely. There would be no more compromises, no more archdukes to send, no more heirs to bury. He would lead his empire into this war, not to save it, but to justify its long decline. And so Austria prepared to fight. On August 6, 1914, it declared war on Russia. Its armies were already marching toward Serbia. Its officers were sharpening plans against Italy. Ambassadors hugged and cried in the street, and its diplomats finally were silent. The empire had made its final bet. It believed that with Germany beside it, victory was still possible, that the Slavs inside and outside its borders could be silenced, that the monarchy could still impose order on a world slipping into chaos. But none of those things were true. Austria-Hungary was entering a war it could not control and would not survive. Franz Josef would not live to see its end, but this war, more than any other moment in his long reign, would define him. It was not his greatest mistake. It was his last act of faith, a final attempt to hold together what time, revolution, and failure had already begun to break apart. He did not rage against the war. He welcomed it. This is where we leave Franz Josef, not in glory, not in failure, but in motion. An emperor who had outlived revolutions, defeats, assassinations, and the slow unraveling of everything he was born to rule. He did not go to war out of madness or ambition, but out of belief that the empire could still be saved, that order could still be restored, that the legacy of the Habsburgs was worth one final stand. But in striking Serbia, he struck the match, and the fire that followed would not be kind to old men or old empires. He would never see the fall, but he helped set it in motion. This was his last act, not as a ruler of peace, but as the reluctant spark in a war of empires. And in the end, that is how history would remember him. A monarch from another age, swept into the abyss by the very traditions he tried to preserve. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the twilight of Franz Josef's empire.